Hey there. Tonight, we're exploring why you wouldn't last a day on the Underground Railroad. The truth is, it wasn't a train at all, just moonlit miles, star-guided turns, and footsteps quiet enough to outsmart a squeaky hinge. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the dark, thinking the Underground Railroad is a secret highway with lantern signals and friendly porches waiting like motel check-ins. That folk song map in your head, the one with the Big Dipper telling you which way to walk, punches your confidence like an energy drink. Then the reality hits. You feel the swamp shift under your feet. The air tastes like rot and salt. The mosquitoes clock in like night shift managers. And you realize you would not last a day. You feel brave until you remember a single number, 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act is fresh law, signed on September 18th. It slaps a $1,000 fine on anyone helping people like you, which in today's money lands in the tens of thousands. Federal commissioners pull in $10 if they send a captured person south, and only $5 if they let someone go, which bakes bias right into the procedure. This is not a fair fight. This is incentive pay for kidnapping. Even in so-called free states, you are not safe. And if you think the North Star is all you need, cloud cover laughs in your face. You keep your mouth closed because dogs taste fear on the air. Bloodhounds cost money, and enslavers treat them like an investment. Newspapers like the Baltimore Sun and the Richmond Inquirer ran runaway ads every week with chilling precision. Scars described, height guessed, clothes listed. A hat with a broken band, a mark on the cheek, a missing finger. You are reduced to a catalog item with a dollar value. Sometimes $100, sometimes $300, sometimes $100, sometimes more for a skilled person who can use an axe, a loom, a forge. This is the part of American history that reads like a ledger book because it was won. You time your move for a Saturday night because even that tiny trick matters. Many enslavers post notices on Mondays. That gives you a full day's head start before the region is warned to watch the roads and waterways. Harriet Tubman understood that detail and used it. You do not travel in a straight line. You are not a straight line person anymore. You circle, then double back, then crawl through reeds you never noticed before, because now they are your camouflage. The ground that once held you in place suddenly has a dozen exits, but each exit comes with a price. You plan to walk by starlight, only trees do not care about your plan. A canopy closes above you, like theatre curtains, and the night air presses in. You hear turtles drop from logs into the water, the sound like someone exhaling in slow motion. You can walk 10 miles in a night if the path is clear. 12 if you are lucky. Some people pushed 20 on wagons or by rail when tickets were found or forged. Crossing Dorchester County, Maryland to the Delaware line is roughly 60 to 80 Maryland, depending on your route. Then about 25 more to Philadelphia. On foot, that is a week, if nothing goes wrong. Nothing going wrong. Never happens. You think you will know a safe house when you see one. That romantic image of a lantern in a window glows in your head. Sometimes a light did serve as a signal, famously at John Rankin's hilltop house in Ripley, Ohio, overlooking the river. But the window lantern legend, as a universal code, belongs more to nostalgia than primary sources. William Still's 1872 book, The Underground Railroad, records case after case where the signal is not a charming lamp, but a person standing exactly where they were told to stand. No flags, no quilt, no neon sign saying good people inside. The first big myth breaks cleanly in your hands. You heard about quilts with secret patterns, and you carried that story like a compass. The diamond tells you when to walk diagonal. The log cabin block says, safe house. That modern myth exploded in 1999 with a book called Hidden in Plain View, claiming a widespread code. Historians chased the citations and found air where evidence should be. No antebellum abolitionist diary mentions a standardized quilt code. Not in Levi Coffin's 1876 memoir. Not in Still's records. Not in Sidney Howard Gay's meticulous record of fugitives for 1855-1856, which documented more than 200 cases with names, dates, fees, and routes. Quilts existed, obviously. So did wishful thinking. You do not navigate the 19th century South with a bedspread like it is, Google Maps stitched by grandma. You keep moving because motion is your only shield. On the road you meet geography that is either your enemy or your shelter. Marshes along Maryland's eastern shore swallow footprints. Bridges choke with watchers. The Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries glitter with opportunities, because boats move faster than feet. Black sailors and stevedores in cities like Baltimore, Norfolk, and Charleston formed quiet solidarities that no poster could measure. Port records, court transcripts, and abolition papers whisper the same thing. Maritime routes mattered. Before 1850, many escapes rode on deck or in hold, not just through cornfields. At midnight, you learn quickly that the Underground Railroad is not underground, and it is not a railroad. It is an ecosystem. Free black barbers who hear everything, porters who pass notes, Quaker farmers like Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, Delaware, who, by his own estimate, assisted roughly 2,700 people and got dragged into court for it in 1848, fined $5,400 for helping the Hawkins family and others. Garrett lost nearly everything and refused to stop. Levi Coffin in Cincinnati and later Fountain City, Indiana, claimed about 3,000 assisted over decades, a number that sounds inflated until you layer it with testimony from fugitives and neighbors. People do not keep ledgers of criminal acts in a police state. Numbers blur at the edges, but the names repeat like drumbeats. You catch yourself making a rookie mistake. You look up. The North Star is not a nightlight trailing you through the forest. You only see it when the clouds break and the tree line opens. You adjust. You read rivers and roads. Instead, you fix east-west by the sunrise and the sound of mills. You use church bells when they exist, not as secret codes, but as community clocks. You check which side moss clings to tree trunks and laugh at yourself, because the moss rule fails in swamps, where everything is damp and the wind has its own ideas. You move. You keep moving. You walk with the memory of the last whipping and the sound of your own breath. At dawn you are not safer. Daytime brings human eyes, Patrols on horseback scan hedgerows. Slave catchers trade tips via telegraph mail, because welcome to the modern age of 1850, where electricity carries news about you faster than your legs carry you away. The United States counted 3,204,313 enslaved people in the 1850 census and nearly 4 million by 1860. Official tallies of fugitives from the state list: only 1,011 in 1850 and 803 in 1860, and 803 in 1860. Numbers that undercount reality by a mile, because census takers were not camping out at night in cornfields with a notebook. Still, the math humbles you. For every person who makes it, hundreds cannot, and it is not for lack of courage. You hit Philadelphia and realize the real railroad hums, with names like William Still, who kept records anyway, because he believed one day they would matter. His office with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society becomes a hazard and a haven at the same time. He logs aliases, fees, dates, the names of vessels and conductors. You learn who else moved north on the same wind. March 1854, Anthony Burns is captured in Boston under the new law and marched through the city streets behind federal troops. Abolitionists raise money to buy him and later succeed, but not before a man is killed trying to rescue him from the courthouse. April 1851, Thomas Sims gets hauled back south. That is the climate. Your shelter in Philadelphia feels like a machine shop building escape, as fast as prosecutors try to tear it apart. You go on, because you can never go back. Harriet Tubman made around 13 rescue trips and brought out approximately 70 people directly, possibly also giving instructions that helped dozens more as they fled on their own. She worked from Dorchester and Caroline counties in Maryland to Delaware, on to Philadelphia, to New York, and then, after 1850, often to Canada West. She carried a pistol. Accounts from her contemporaries note that she would use forceful persuasion when someone panicked and wanted to turn back because a returning person endangered the entire party. Sources like Sarah Bradford's 1869 biography preserve stories of her carrying remedies to quiet crying infants on the trail, which tells you the stakes, without any romantic overlay. Tubman's line that she never lost a passenger is the victory lap earned by someone who ran the kind of race you cannot even picture. You learn the rules rewired by pain. Do not travel in predictable lines. Do not linger where free black communities are small and exposed. Trust the route through Wilmington, the discreet streets in Philadelphia, the basements in Harrisburg or Columbia, Pennsylvania, where people who have almost nothing will share it with you. When the railroads actually help, you take them. You have abolitionists who buy tickets, disguise you in a coat too big for your shoulders, pair you with someone who will call you by a false name before anyone else does. You do not pull a Sherlock Holmes with elaborate costumes baked with symbolism. You do ordinary camouflage. You become wallpaper. You think Canada like it is heaven on a map. After 1850, a lot of people did exactly that, because British law ended slavery empire-wide in 1834. By the late 1850s, Canada West held roughly 20,000 to 30,000 black residents, a mix of those born free, those who migrated, and those who self-emancipated. Towns like St. Catharines, where Harriet Tubman lived for a time on North Street, and Windsor across from Detroit, and Buxton near Chatham, and Dawn Settlement near Dresden under Josiah Henson's leadership, built schools, churches, and livelihoods. The word terminus has a pleasant click to it. Life on the ground involved discrimination, hard winters, and jobs people had to wrestle into existence. It still beat the math on American law enforcement getting paid by the capture. You keep hearing about heroes, and you revise that file in your head. The Underground Railroad ran on black leadership. White allies mattered. Some at tremendous human cost. But free black communities built the web that kept people like you from vanishing between county lines. David Ruggles and the New York Committee of Vigilance were already active in the 1830s, long before the famous cases headline northern newspapers. In 1855 and 1856, editor Sidney Howard Gay in New York recorded about 200 escapes in his private ledger that historians use today like a Rosetta Stone of the network. Frederick Douglass in Rochester reportedly assisted many, turning his home and office into a relay station near Lake Ontario. He avoided detailed records because police love paper trails. Smart people in dangerous rooms made strategic decisions that look cold on paper and feel like salvation in person. You learn that the Underground Railroad had a southern branch that barely makes the popular sagas. To the west, enslaved people from Texas and Louisiana slipped south into Mexico in the 1830s through the 1830s because Mexico abolished slavery nationally in 1829, with complications in Texas that ended when Texas rebelled and then joined the United States. Historians estimate that several thousand crossed into Mexico despite armed patrols and the Rio Grande's hazards. Seminole Maroons and Black Seminoles made that dangerous transit, with leaders like John Horse. The map you memorized in school focused on Canada because the textbooks you read loved neat northern arrows. The reality sent lines south as well as north to mountains and swamps and any border that did not recognize a bill of sale. You understand why the Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina line looms like a ghost story that turns out to be true. Archaeologists and historians document maroon communities sheltering there for decades, possibly centuries, with peaks in the 19th century. The swamp once spanned thousands of square miles in the 18th century, later shrunken to about 112,000 acres, preserved as a refuge today. People dug canals and logged cypress under brutal conditions, and some enslaved laborers fled into the green-black heart to live in hidden camps. Survival in that terrain demands skills that your camping app does not teach. Your big modern takeaway is simple. You are soft. They were not. You think you will get a breather once you cross the Mason-Dixon line. The law shoves that straight off a bridge. In 1842, the Supreme Court case Prigg v. Pennsylvania weakened state-level protections by restricting how states could interfere with slave catchers. In 1850, Congress hands federal machinery to the capture business. Even Massachusetts, with its personal liberty laws, becomes a battleground. The Jerry Rescue in Syracuse, October 1851, shows a multiracial crowd smashing a jail window with a beam and spiriting William Jerry Henry away. In 1854, runaway ads, federal warrants, and U.S. Marines escort Anthony Burns through Boston after a show trial. The North likes to brag about conscience and then sends troops to guard a man's forced march. You guard your own movement with the same ice in your veins. You learn the economics because the economics learn you. Franklin and Armfield, the notorious slave trading firm based out of Alexandria, and New Orleans, shipped people inland and south by the tens of thousands in the 1820s and 1830s. Catchers and traders exist on a scale that dwarfs your personal escape. It is a machine. You are one person defying a machine. You do it anyway. That becomes the most American sentence you can speak without words. You feel the weight of babies on the trail, not because you carry one, but because you hear how others did. You hear about Eliza in Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, leaping across the ice. Then you read accounts from William Still and realize mothers did cross frozen rivers with infants to muffle, not for melodrama, but because time is colder than water. You do not need the fiction to feel the proof. The Garner case in 1856 in Cincinnati shows a woman named Margaret Garner recaptured with her family, killing her young daughter rather than see her return to slavery. News accounts and court documents carry that grim fact through time. Anyone selling you a clean story is selling a false one. You get a reminder that some escapes do not involve swamps or forests at all, and you smile grimly at the irony. December 1848. Ellen and William Craft travel from Macon, Georgia, to Philadelphia and beyond using a disguise. Ellen, light-skinned and determined, poses as a wealthy white male, invalid traveling with a devoted enslaved valet, played by William. Trains, steamers, and hotels take them north because people saw what they expected to see in a world that worships money and rank. When Boston is no longer safe in 1850, they flee to England and publish their narrative in 1860, running 1,000 miles for freedom. The word 1,000 is not metaphor. It reads like a receipt. March 1849, Henry Box Brown mails himself from Richmond to Philadelphia in a wooden crate 3 feet long by 2 feet 8 inches deep by 2 feet wide. The trip lasts about 27 hours by wagon, railroad, and steamboat, and he arrives at the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society with bruised ribs and an undented will. Abolitionist James Miller McKim and William Still witnessed the opening of the box. Brown recounts that he sang, which the newspapers ate up like candy. The sense of theatre made him famous and controversial because publicity cuts both ways. He leaves for England after the 1850 law turns his fame into a crosshair. You do not try the box. Your claustrophobia would out you before the first rail stop. You get a lesson in silence from Harriet Jacobs. She spends roughly 7 years, from 1835 to 1842, in a small garret above her grandmother's home in Edenton, North Carolina, hiding from an enslaver who will not let go. The crawl space measured about 9 feet long and 7 feet wide, but only around 3 feet high, in places barely enough to sit. She watches her children play through a tiny peephole. She writes incidents in the life of a slave girl, published in 1861, confirming what rumor could not carry. Survival sometimes means not moving at all. Your modern brain recoils. Your spine complains on her behalf. You realize that the Underground Railroad includes attics, cellars, ship holds, and ordinary rooms where time locks itself against you. You understand that paperwork is both weapon and threat. 4 forged passes work. Sailors' protection papers work. On the urban routes, being literate can be a lifesaver, and teaching reading to enslaved people remains illegal in many places. This repression does not stop it. The skill can curve your life away from a patrol, a ledger, or a man with a pen, willing to sell you back to hell. Solomon Northup, born free in New York, gets drugged in Washington, D.C. in 1841 and sold south for 12 years. His 1853 memoir, 12 Years a Slave, nails the terror of kidnapping down with dates and names. Free black people were not safe anywhere near the borderline, and even far north, the danger followed them. You change how you think about the word rescue. The Christiana resistance on September 11th, 1851, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, shows William Parker and a group of black neighbors resisting Maryland slaveholder Edward Gorsuch, who was killed in the confrontation. Dozens face indictment for treason. The jury acquits. The case becomes a national fire alarm that the North will not simply hand over human beings on demand. Rescue is not always a quiet knock on a back door. Sometimes it is a crowd with a plan that ends in gunpowder and courtrooms. You strip down your ideas of who saved whom because the evidence forces you. Women like Laura Haviland in Michigan risk everything. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper raises money and a storm of words. Sojourner Truth walks, talks, fundraises, and frightens men who pledged themselves brave. Quaker families break the law with a serene stubbornness that prosecutors hate. But black barbershop networks, church deacons, midwives, stevedores, hack drivers, and peddlers form the arteries. Newspapers sometimes credited white benefactors because white editors saw what they wanted to see. Private ledgers and black testimony recorded the rest. The power of the Underground Railroad sat in a quiet majority of uncredited hands. You watch allies split strategy. Some argue the legal path. States like Vermont and Massachusetts pass personal liberty laws to obstruct federal capture machines. Enablement v. Booth, 1859. The Supreme Court slaps down Wisconsin's attempt to defy the Fugitive Slave Act, which shows you again that paper shields bend under power. Others go direct action. The Boston Vigilance Committee breaks Shadrach Minkins out of custody in 1851 and funnels him to Canada. The fight rides on both tracks. You move along the safer one, if there is such a thing. You notice how the Underground Railroad actually used railroads, because the name was not wrong by accident. Conductors bought tickets or smuggled people in baggage cars. Stations were safe houses. The terminology appears in print by the 1840s. One story traces the name to 1831 in Ohio with a man named Tice Dave Davids, who escaped across the Ohio River and disappeared. So mysteriously his pursuer blamed an underground railroad. Whatever the origin, the phrase stuck hard because people love metaphors. Just do not let the metaphor fool you into thinking this was easy. It was logistics under siege. You feel the financial strain because even coffee costs money, and coffee is what keeps conductors awake. Abolitionists fundraise through fairs and lectures. Frederick Douglass edits the North Star in Rochester starting in 1847 and uses speeches to collect funds in rooms filled with supporters and hecklers. He and others funnel money to where it matters, not just pamphlets and podiums, but also tickets, shoes, and food. In $1850, a journey could cost the equivalent of months of wages. Donos made the difference between someone walking 400 miles and someone vanishing at mile 40. You digest a hard truth about numbers. because people love asking for a total head count, like this is a basketball game. No one knows precisely how many self-emancipated people reached the North or Canada through the network. Estimates range from tens of thousands across decades to a few thousand per year at peaks. Official statistics were built to minimize reality and protect the feelings of people who sold children. What can be counted can comfort. What cannot be counted compels humility. That is the real math lesson. You collect navigation tips that would impress any survival influencer. Hide in plain sight. Turn your coat. Carry a hammer for the train coupling in case you get shoved into a boxcar, not because you will heroic your way out, but because maybe you can wedge a vent so you do not suffocate. Aim for river towns with abolitionist newspapers and black churches. Head for Syracuse, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Albany, New Bedford, and Portsmouth, because these names show up repeatedly in the ledgers. When sheriffs look for a man, be two women. When they look for a family, be a hired hand walking alone. Harriet Tubman scouted, planned, and pivoted. She moved people on Saturday nights. She targeted harvest seasons when enslavers were busiest and patrols spread thin. Strategy counts when mercy does not. You keep your eye on the distances because the romance of the road evaporates under mileage. Baltimore to Philadelphia by foot and ferries is roughly 100 miles. Philadelphia to New York City is another 95. New York City to Albany, about 150. Albany to the Canadian border is several hundred more, depending on the crossing. Detroit to Windsor is a river's width that can turn into a 100-foot wide barricade of ice or a death-swift current. People crossed on boats, slipped across with the help of fishermen, or walked the river when it froze. Stories like the one about Eliza exist because winter writes its own rules. You slice away another myth. Songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd have been promoted as encoded maps. Historians who traced the supposed origin found the trail leads to a version collected in the 20th century, with shaky antebellum proof. That does not mean spirituals were not layered with hidden meanings about hope, solidarity, or escape. It means the specific claim that this song, mapped a precise route, has little documentary oxygen. You do not need folklore to carry you north, when the names William Still and Sidney Howard Gay already mapped the routes with dates and ticket stubs. You stare at the risk to the helpers and let it land. In 1848, Thomas Garrett's courtroom speech told the judge he had helped and would continue, which is the kind of line that makes a statue look timid. Judges bankrupted him anyway. Levi Coffin lost businesses and got threatened. Ordinary farmers who fed strangers risked their barns and their freedom. In Kentucky and Missouri, crossing the river did not just hazard a night in jail. It threatened decades in a cell, or a beating designed to send a message. Some people still paid the price. You do not treat courage like a collectible. You treat it like bail money for the next traveler. You reach upstate New York and taste Canada in the air, and you pause because the world pivots. Frederick Douglass, who once fled slavery himself, gets a visit from John Brown in 1859, suggesting a plan to spark an uprising from the mountains of Virginia. Douglass thinks it reckless. He was right. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October collapses. Brown is hanged December 2nd, 1859, and the nation tips further toward war. The Underground Railroad kept operating right under that coming storm, then shifts when the Civil War begins. In April 1861, enslaved people run to Union lines and declare themselves contraband of war. General Benjamin Butler likes the legalism because it kneecaps Confederates. Suddenly, the road north glows with army campfires instead of lanterns in windows. Different danger. Different rules. Same urgency. You think about what freedom looks like when you finally step on Canadian soil. There is a church service at the British Methodist Episcopal congregation in a place like St. Catherine's, where the minister's voice carries a mile. There are fields at dawn, settlement where Josiah Henson and others build a sawmill, a farm, and a school. There is land purchased in Elgin's settlement, Buxton, where families farm their own acres and children ring the school bell. Census records from 1861 list black families with tools of their own. A certificate of freedom in your pocket beats a protection paper with a white man's name written over you. The winter still bites hard. Racism does not vanish in a puff of northern smoke, but no one in uniform orders you back south for cash. You survey what you survived, and the self-congratulation dies on your lips because millions more did not get this chance. Some resisted in place. Some negotiated with skill and increments. Some married time itself and waited for the Union Army to come banging down the road. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863. Freeing enslaved people in rebelling states as the army can reach them. It becomes law that a soldier can unchain you rather than chain you. By December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment ends legal slavery across the United States, except as punishment for crime. The railroad, as a clandestine system, fades because it does not need to hide under the law's floorboards anymore. You turn back to the beginning, and the slogans about how you would not last a day feel less like insults and more like awe. It is not that your modern self cannot handle a hike. It is that the rules of the game were written to prevent you from even entering the forest. You stand here only because people who had no reason to believe they could win decided to move anyway. Some moved by foot, some by boat, some by paper, some by force, some by the patience of a life lived in the margin of an attic, on a riverbank at midnight, in the cover of a potato field, where breath itself is a tell. You keep sharp about the history because myth is a comfort item. Quilts as codes feel good because they make resistance domestic and decorative. Songs as maps feel good because they put poetry over terror. White saviors rescuing helpless people feels good to the ego. The record shows something more complicated and more powerful. Black resistance founded the system. Allies became part of that architecture. Together, they formed one of the deepest networks of civil disobedience in American history, one ledger entry at a time. The receipts sit in books. William Still's, 1872. William Still's, 1872 volume, packed with names. Sidney Howard Gay's notebooks preserved in archives. Levi Coffin's 1876 Reminiscences. Narratives by Henry Box Brown, the Crafts, Douglas, and Jacobs. Court testimony from Christiana and Boston. The relentless ink of runaway ads. You carry the small details that strip the romance, but deepen the reverence. Shoes that did not fit, passed from hand to hand. Cornbread and salt herring, carried in a bag. A baby soothed in the crook of a stranger's arm, while adults calculated risk by the minute. People walked with floorboards, creaking in their memory, because the sound could still betray them years later. Not every act is recordable. Some of the bravest never got their names printed anywhere but family stories. That absence is not an excuse to invent new myths. It is a prompt to hold the ones we can prove more carefully. You know the Underground Railroad. Left tracks you can still trace on a map if you know where to look. Oberlin, Ohio, where a rescue in 1858 snatched John Price back from custody and set off a federal-state standoff. Detroit's Second Baptist Church, where farewell ceremonies welcomed new arrivals before the river crossing. Philadelphia's Lombard Street corridor, where William Still lived and worked. Niagara Falls, where steam and cold blinded watchers and cast a thunderous curtain over escapes. The actual spaces exist. Brick and mortar beat folklore when you want to know what actually happened. You replay the journey and realize how close to failure many nights came. Blisters turned to infections without antibiotics. Coughs turned to alarms in quiet houses. Wrong turns end in the wrong man's field. It is not a lack of pluck that kills. It is a universe of tiny hazards, compounded by law, backed by money, enforced by men with guns. Survival reads like an equation where every variable wanted to push you back. The solution required a network, acting like an immune system, with information and care moving faster than the disease. You place the Underground Railroad in the pantheon of American courage without turning it into a fairy tale. You hold the names that repeat in the sources, the dates you can anchor to newspaper clippings, the locations you can stand in today. You do not need imaginary quilts or lantern signals to feel the suspense. You feel it in the recorded account of a wagon crossing a state line at dawn, with a couple hidden under produce, in the train manifest with a false name scribbled by a nervous conductor, in the courtroom transcript where a judge declares a man property and an audience does not accept it. You walk away with a final, slightly sardonic truth. For all the talk about law and order, the Underground Railroad reminds you that order is not a virtue when the law is wrong. The people who broke those laws built a higher order, one measured by moral arithmetic rather than fines and fees. When the United States paid commissioners $10 to send a person back south, it advertised exactly what kind of order it valued. The railroad answered with tickets purchased in secret, planks lifted in cellar floors, whispered directions at night, and the stubborn, brilliant talent for survival that keeps appearing in the sources like a heartbeat. You, with your protein shakes and fitness tracker and knowledge of star constellations from a phone app, would not last a day. That is the point. The day belonged to people whose names you can name because they wrote them down, and far more who never had that luxury. The unglamorous facts are the most astonishing ones. A 3-foot-high garret, a 27-hour box, a ledger with 200 cases scribbled down across 2 years, because one editor decided secrecy and memory could share space, a woman who made a dozen trips into danger with a pistol and a plan and walked dozens of people out of bondage because she refused to internalize the math of despair. You stand in the dark at the edge of a swamp. You listen. You smell the wet wood, the animal musk, the smoke from a distant fire. You put 1 foot forward and then another because your country declared your body the property of someone else, and you will not agree. You are outnumbered, outpoliced, and outfunded. You are not outwilled. That is why the Underground Railroad matters. Not for the romance, for the receipts, And the receipt says this: people with the least legal power in the United States built one of the most effective resistance networks in its history, moved human lives along it by the thousands over decades, adapted when the law changed, and kept going until the country itself had to change with them. Our journey through history continues with day in the life of a why you wouldn't last a day. You step into the gymnasium at dawn, expecting a classy marble spa with a side of Plato. What hits you is a blast of cold air, olive oil, and dust. No yoga mats, no protein bars, no shorts at all. The word gymnasium comes from gymnos, meaning naked, and the ancient Greeks took the etymology with brutal sincerity. By the time the roosters of Attica wind down, the place is already a churn of bare bodies, slick with oil and powdered with earth, bouncing light off porticos and columns as the sun climbs. You arrive thinking you're about to reenact a tasteful statue. You're about to reenact a sandblaster. The rules are ancient and not negotiable. Strip in the apodiatrion, the undressing room. Stow your clothes and sandals. If you're clutching a water bottle and a smartwatch, abandon the fantasy. You carry an Araballos, a small clay flask of olive oil, something like 50 to 100 milliliters. You tie it to your wrist with a string so it doesn't get stolen. Theft is a real thing. Even Plato's friends didn't trust a crowded changing room. The staff here are professionals. An aleptet, the oiler, and masseur, a paidotribes, the hands-on trainer, and a gymnastes, the boss. They share space with philosophers, poets, and the odd civic decree, chiseled into stone. Hermes and Heracles have altars in the courtyard, because if you're going to pray for good grip and bad luck for your rival, you go straight to the patron saints of male sweat. You brace for modesty and find none. Thucydides, writing around 431 Bas, spelled it out. Earlier Greeks wore loincloths to compete, then dropped them. He even says Spartans led the charge on public nudity. Orsippus of Megara supposedly tossed his loincloth during a race in 710-20 base and won the Olympic station. Whatever the origin story, the result is your situation. You are suddenly, gloriously, and terrifyingly, historically accurate. There's a reason the Ellipterion, the oiling room, sits near the entrance. Training starts with oil. Olive oil is expensive in ancient Athens, which makes it both a status flex and a sticky trap. The Elliptes smears you with a thin coat that feels luxurious for approximately 8 seconds. Then comes dust. The conisterion, the dusting room, holds fine sand that sticks to the oil. Think of it as grip-enhancing exfoliant, sold in no stores and recommended by no dermatologists. The logic holds. Without dust, you're a buttered statue sliding across marble. With dust, you can actually throw someone. Without launching yourself into orbit. You're basically breaded for combat. No time for introspection. Warm-ups begin in the zastostos, the covered track. In good weather, you'll also use the open track outside. The paradromis, but mornings in Athens can be chilly. The zistos has a long colonnade for running, especially in winter when rain turns the outdoor ground into mud. You run barefoot, because shoes here are for traveling, not training. The floor is sand over packed earth. Your modern feet protest, like a union with good lawyers. The first lap bites, The second draws blood. By the third, you feel every pebble personally and resentfully, like each one holds a grudge. The distances mean business. A stadion at Olympia is 600 feet, roughly 192 meters. Not all stadia are the same length, because Greek feet varied by city, but the vibe stays lethal. The Diolos doubles it. The Dolichos goes long, roughly 7 to 24 stadia, something like 1.4 to nearly 5 kilometers, depending on whom you ask and where you measure. And where you measure. You're not in a race today, but the drills pull from the same menu. Short sprints, repeat intervals, out and backs that melt your lungs. The air tastes dusty and metallic. Your breath clouds as you pass a herm, one of those rectangular stone pillars with a head and a very literal lower feature. Herms are good luck guardians of boundaries, trade, and travel. Athens takes them seriously, as 415 BC proved, when the city practically imploded after a mass mutilation of Herms on the night before the Sicilian expedition. Even stone sentries can trigger constitutional crises here. Arms burn, chest heaves, and your coach is not into affirmations. The Paedotrides doesn't pat backs. He corrects form. He might carry a rod for emphasis, because ancient pedagogy takes a material approach to motivation. You dust your shoulders again. The sun keeps rising. The smell is now half olive, half people, with a garnish of iron and clay. This is the part where your modern mind looks for music. Forget it. There is a flute player sometimes, an Orlo's piper who keeps rhythm for group exercises, but it's not a Spotify banner list, and the soundtrack is mostly exhales, footfalls, and the soft percussive hiss of sand. Calisthenics follow, and they're not gentle. You swing halters, stone or metal weights shaped like weird lumps, up to your shoulders, forward, and behind your back. These aren't barbells. They look like something a cyclops drops on his foot and then yells at a mountain. Then comes long jump practice. The Greeks actually jump with halteres in their hands. They claim it helps momentum, like a pendulum, and they aren't wrong. Modern tests show you can jump farther with a well-timed swing. The technique demands serious coordination. You swing forward and leap from a soft sandpit, land hard, and faceplant your second try. Applause does not follow. Then javelin drills. Throwing spears in a gym might sound reckless, and it is, but this isn't a spear for war. It's a thinner, lighter javelin for sport, with a leather thong called an ankyle near the center. You hook a finger into the thong to get spin and extra distance. Without the thong, your throw looks like a bird aborting takeoff. With it, even your clumsy toss flips, end over end, like a page out of a physics textbook nobody wrote yet. Discus follows, a flat, circular weight of stone or bronze. You spin, you release, you pray. The discus spins into a sunbeam and kisses the earth 20 meters away. Your wrist remembers it for 2 days. The palestra, wrestling, ground calls. This is the beating heart of the gymnasium. The surface is dust over packed clay, not a springy mat. The goal is elegant, brutal simplicity. Throw your opponent so that his back, shoulders, or hip hits the ground. 3 times. Your mind hears wrestling and imports choreographed flips. The Greeks bring leverage, grips, sudden crashing non-theatrics, takedowns, trips, hooks, over-unders, and the collar and elbow tie flow into one another. Oil would be a disaster here, so you dust up again. Everyone looks like a sugar-dusted pastry made by a vindictive baker. Philostratus, writing in the 3rd century CE in Gymnasticus, describes the holds and cautions about trickiness against rules. He comes centuries later, but he records a tradition already old in his day. No biting or gouging here. Those live next door in Pancratian land. Referees carry rods and don't mind using them. They're not referees in the sense of mild suggestions. They're Hellenodikai at the big games, rod-bearing umpires in daily training, and these rods sting like policy. You learn fast what cauliflower ear meant before mixed martial arts commentary. 100,000 grips later, cartilage yields. Greek statues of athletes show it, and a Hellenistic bronze, known as the boxer at rest, wears it like a crown. You practice throws. Your opponent hits you with a clean foot, sweep. It looks delicate. It empties your lungs against earth, like a trap door opening. The sound you make impresses nobody. Boxing awaits, and by now, your inner monologue threatens to unionize. Greek boxers don't wear gloves. They wrap their hands in leather thongs called hamantes. The older style uses soft oxhide strips. Later versions get harder and nastier. None of it cushions the blow. It just protects knuckles so they can keep inflicting damage. Faces break. Noses flatten. Mouths split. The rules are simple. Keep hitting until someone yields or drops. Footwork exists, but snuggling your face behind headgear does not. Greek comedy loved taking shots at the athlete diet and brain fog. Xenophanes grumbled that cities spent too much money on athletes. Aristophanes mocked pampered, perfumed gym-goers. And you suddenly feel very sympathetic to both of them. Your coach sends you to the korikos, the punching bag. It's a leather sack full of flour or sand, suspended from a beam. The bag shifts unpredictably. You aim. You connect. The bag returns the favor. You meet it with your lip. Blood tastes like old copper. Somewhere a flute plays a neat triplet under your messy rhythm. Mid-morning slides toward noon. Philosophers drift in, like birds toward a fountain. The Lyceum, Aristotle's school, sat directly in a gymnasium. He arrived in Athens in 335 BAS and taught by walking under colonnades, lecturing while his students paced. The academy, where Plato's school met, was also linked to a gymnasium, and the third great Athenian gymnasium, Cynosarges, served citizens of mixed parentage. Gymnasia knit together muscle and mind in a way that looks suspiciously like a wellness trend until you remember the dust. Statues of Hermes look on with that inscrutable smirk that always seems like he knows where your sandals are when you do not. You rest in the shade, lean against a column, and scrape. The strigil, the stalanges, in Greek, is a curved metal scraper shaped like a very aggressive letter J. After exercises, people scrape oil, sweat, and dust off the skin with it. The sound is soft, like skimming wet sand. The scrape leaves pink, freshly abraded skin. The residue has a name, gloios. Doctors buy it. Yes, the gunk scraped off the bodies of athletes becomes medicine. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE in Natural History, Book 28, lists athlete scrapings as remedies for everything from muscle aches to fevers, because, If there's a bodily fluid, someone in antiquity turned it into a cure. You stare at the accumulating substance with the dawning horror of a modern who has seen too many moisturizers and not enough evidence. Your ellipteds would like you to know Gloyos commands a price because branding is eternal and weird. Lunch sneaks up during the brightest, hottest part of the day. No protein shakes. You chew on barley cakes called maza, maybe a wedge of goat cheese, a handful of figs or olives. Meat for athletes is a real thing, in some cases. Anecdotes about famous strongmen like Milo of Croton, eating absurd amounts measured in talents and drama, but daily training diets lean humble, bread, cheese, fruit. Galen, the 2nd century sea physician and gym enthusiast, wrote on exercise with the small ball and exercise with the small ball and on hygiene, recommending moderate exercise and chiding overtraining. He names ball games for circulation, gentle runs for circulation, gentle runs for digestion, oil rub-downs to keep joints happy. You eat like a farmer, not a bodybuilder, and you prepare to return to a sport that thinks biting is a technical foul only in one event. Afternoon heat presses. The spherist area, the ball court, comes alive. Ball games in Greek gyms look less like soccer and more like keep away with attitude. Pheninda emphasizes feints and quick passes. Episkyros uses lines on the ground, and 2 teams trying to shove each other backward with a mix of throws and mayhem. Harpaston, later popular with Romans, shares the DNA. This is not a sanctioned Olympic event. This is a glorious midday excuse to sprint, swear, and test reflexes. Galen praises small ball work for agility. You praise it for not requiring you to be pile-driven face first. But the gymnasium doesn't let you coast. The gymnastes waves you back to strength drills. Weighted lifts use stone discs, sand-filled bags, and your own body. The pull-up bar doesn't exist, but rings of rope and wooden bars serve. Rope climbing chews your hands instantly. Without chalk, you rely on dust. Sweat instantly eats the dust. Ancient problem, eternal answer. More dust. You look like breaded calamari in human form. The architecture itself becomes a kind of psychological coach. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, writing in De Architectura, Book 5, 1st century Bas, lays out how to build a proper Greek gymnasium, a large peristyle court, Stostos to the north, for winter training, an open track to the south for summer, and rooms around for baths, oiling, dusting, and ball play. His account reflects a Greek model that matured across the 4th, 3rd centuries, BC, and spread in the Hellenistic world. Rome later turbocharged the baths, adding hot rooms, caldaria, and massive thermae. Your day in late classical Athens still ends with cold water in a simple basin, a lutron that shocks even your teeth. No steam room. No eucalyptus towels. Just an amphora of "this will make you yelp." Between sets, one more reality check intrudes. Gymnasia aren't just for sweat. They are civic spaces. In Athens, young citizens, be a Phoebus, around 18 to 20, do their military and civic training connected to these places. They learn how to march, throw a javelin, run in armor, and uphold the weirdly specific Athenian habit of debating olive trees. The alphabet oath survives on stone. To fight for temples and tombs, to obey magistrates, to transmit the fatherland, not less, but greater. Roman-era inscriptions preserve the names of gymnasiarchs who funded oil for all, because generosity in antiquity loves a plaque. You, as a drop-in visitor to this civic temple of sweat, would meet officialdom at the door. Citizens get privileges. Metics and foreigners might be tolerated in some cases, excluded in others. The rules fluctuate by city and century, but the gymnasium is never just a gym. Back to violence. Pancration waits. If wrestling feels like chess, and boxing feels like a bar fight with footwork, pancration is a rules-light meeting of the two. The official bans are simple. No biting, no gouging. Everything else negotiates between pain and showmanship. Philostratus records the culture of pancrationists mastering holds that blend striking and grappling. Aristotle mentions gymnastike as one side of education, alongside of education, music and letters. But the lesson right now is practical anatomy. Knees to the body, trips, hammerlocks, chokes. Chokeholds matter desperately here, and a well-timed strangle can finish a bout in seconds. History leaves a body on this sand. Arachin of Phigalia died in 564 bags at Olympia, his opponent submitting in the same breath. Pausanias, 8401, records it. Arachin's trainer shouted to him to endure. The opponent twisted. Arachin broke free with a foot hook and shoulder wrench, and in the writhing tangle, Arachin suffocated. Judges crowned his corpse the victor. A statue stood there. Athletes in the gymnasium know the story. You now know the tone. The ref carries a rod. He watches for fingers probing eyes. He ignores knees grinding ribs. You feint a strike and get scooped, folded, and encouraged by gravity to stop acting. The pain feels immediate and ancient because nothing about how joints protest changes across millennia. You tumble out, gasp, and suck in a full lung of dust. Breathing becomes filing paperwork in triplicate. Your skin now demonstrates why you wouldn't last a day. Oil goes on. Dust sticks. Strigil scrapes. Cold water locks in. Goosebumps. Your modern skincare routine dies on the first pass of a bronze scoop. Microabrasions pepper your pores. Without antibiotics, an angry cut becomes a friend for weeks. Trainers use wine, vinegar, and honey as antiseptics, and honey in particular performs decently by modern standards. The sting feels like an educational lecture. Every cut invites infection in a world without penicillin. Every bruise blossoms without arnica. The gymnasium reminds you it predates your medicine cabinet by 2,000 years and does not care. The social rules stretch further. Women do not work out here, at least not adult citizen women in classical Athens. There are separate spaces in some cities where women could exercise, especially in later periods and in different Greek communities, but this courtyard belongs to men and youths. The Olympics banned married women from spectating. Pausanias, 567, rights of the law, threatening death for violators, and the legend of Kallipateira, a mother who sneaked in disguised as a trainer to see her son, then accidentally exposed herself in her excitement when he won. She was pardoned because of her athletic family, but officials decreed that trainers must henceforth be nude to prevent such disguises. Equal opportunity, mortification, solves many ancient administrative problems. You carry on, not because you feel heroic, but because stopping now means stiffening in place like a tragic statue. The second wind comes during a slower technical drill. You practice the starting stance for the stadion race. Feet placed in shallow grooves, hips forward, arms ready. Archaeologists have found stone, starting lines with carved toe grooves, at stadia across the Greek world. They ground you in granite reality. The starter once dropped a rope, called a heisplex, to release runners simultaneously. False starts happen, and penalties sting. You start on breath, not on gun. The suddenness of the burst disguises that it grows out of hours, of method and repetition. Then a lighter station, the discus ring again, but with coaching on spins and footwork. Ancient discuses survive in museums, with weights ranging from under 2 kilograms to over 5, so you pick something that doesn't dislocate your shoulder out of habit. The sunlight hits the bronze face as it flies, a small eclipse cutting a path through Athenian air. You release, pivot, and watch it land at a neat angle, digging a small wound in the earth, like a tiny agricultural experiment, gone wrong. Shade again, another scrape. You now understand why herms lined gym entrances, altars stood in corners, and philosophers haunted the porticos. The gymnasium forms a little city within a city, an ecosystem where muscles, ritual, law, and gossip cross-pollinate. Socrates famously walked through gymnasia, needling people with questions. Antisthenes spoke in the Cynosarges. Socrates recruited youths with letters as well as squats. The Ephebeia used gymnasia as headquarters for training new citizens. The Panathenaic festival, all Athens, paraded to the Acropolis, wove in gym-trained bodies carrying shields. Greek education sits on a 2-legged stool, musike and gymnastike. You chose the leg that kicks you. But the day isn't over. A trainer decides the hoplodromos will brighten moods. It will not. The armed race uses a helmet, a shield, and sometimes greaves. By the classical period, the greaves are often gone, but the shield remains. 2 stadion lengths, roughly 384 meters at Olympia, in armor. The shield weighs several kilograms. The helmet reduces airflow. The sand grabs your feet. Everything after 10 steps feels like you live at the bottom of a well. The muscles that stabilize your core whisper about reassignment. You finish, and your shoulders ask to secede from the federation of your body. Somewhere nearby, altars smoke faintly. Hermes, god of boundaries, and the gym, and Heracles, patron of impossible labors, receive their due. Dedications on stone-list donors, donors who paid for oil for a year. Inscriptions name-dropping gymnasiarchs, litter Hellenistic and Roman cityscapes. The gymnasium's economy wraps around olive presses, pottery workshops, perfumers, and water carriers. Your day plugs into a web of craftsmen and specialists that makes the place run. The earaballos that you tied around your wrist, earlier came from a shop that also makes perfume bottles. Your strigil came from a bronze smith who stamps a little mark under the curve. The dust itself gets swept into corners and tipped out, then footprints start again tomorrow before dawn. The H's that build now, create the final exhibit in the case against you lasting a day here. Without caffeine spiking your system, you rely on grapes and grit. The Greeks cut wine with water, a practice that keeps civic order and heads clearer. They drink kykeon, a barley and water blend, sometimes flavored with herbs. There's no electrolyte science, only experience. Dehydration nags like a drill sergeant with disappointments. Heat sinks into your bones. The sun burns shoulders that haven't felt direct exposure under a modern shirt in years. Sunscreen exists on no shelf. Olive oil gives you a gentle sheen and zero ultraviolet protection. Tomorrow's peel will be forensic. Meanwhile, the idea that all Greek athletes looked like sculpted perfection falls apart on contact. Sculptors carved ideals. Polykletos Doryphoros lays out a canon for how muscles ought to hang on bones, not how real bodies did after a 3-hour pancration drill. Real athletes carry extra around the middle for fuel, thick necks from resisting chokes, and odd asymmetries from spears, always thrown with the same arm. Ears swell, noses skew. Pindar's victory, Ode's name champions who glow with ardor, excellence, but their kitchens smell like garlic and sweat, not perfume counters. You stretch under the portico, a colonnade of Doric rhythm, boxing time into shade and heat, and the sound of a reed pipe floats from a corner where a boy practices. A scribe copies a decree about gym conduct, something about times, about order, about banning disorderly revelry. Rhabdophoroi, the rod-bearers, enforce decorum. A pair of ephebibs practice shield drills in step with a teacher calling cadence. After Alexander the Great changes the map, gymnasia explode across the eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to Bactria. In Ptolemaic Egypt, gym membership marks Greek civic identity. Distribution of oil becomes a political topic. The Hellenistic world invites everyone to the gym if they tick the right cultural boxes. You're standing at the origin point of a global franchise, with a deep bench of rules and deeper wells of sweat. When you finally head for the baths, you pass the Ellipterion again. Rows of erbaloi hang on pegs. Some are plain clay, others elegantly painted. Athletes carry them looped on. Cords and archaeologists pull them from graves like receipts for past dedication. You tip more oil onto your arms and thighs. The strigil sweeps your skin. You scrape, wipe the curve clean, and scrape again. The residue clings, then falls into a basin. Someone mutters about selling it, and you decide never to touch your face again with anything that didn't grow on a tree and get washed first. The cold bath sits like a dare. Early Greek gyms rarely had hot water. Rome will change that later. You squat, pour, gasp, and your heart tries a new rhythm. The lutron sluices away, dust, and some fatigue. It returns your breath to you. It fails to return your dignity after you squeal. Song echoes off stone. The sun tilts. Your stomach suggests dinner. Olive oil lamps begin to blink on in the city, beyond. Little floating islands in the coming blue. One last ritual calls you back into the courtyard near dusk. The trainers rub down, sore muscles, kneading oil into calves, shoulders, back. This is the closest thing to mercy here. The Aliptad knows anatomy by feel. He finds knots you didn't know you owned. Galen would approve. Warm hands push lactic acid somewhere. Better than where it sits. Now, you float half an inch above your body for a minute and think well of olive trees and their stubborn, graceful efficiency. Olive harvests in Attica were lifeblood. The trees carefully counted, protected by law. Athens' patron goddess is literally Athena, giver of the olive. Your entire day runs on that sap. Evening tips toward conversation. Gymnasia often doubled as debate halls. Socrates used them as fishing holes for arguments. He drifted through the palastra of Taureas in Plato's Lysis and paraded into the gym of the handsome charmaids in Plato's dialogue of that name, always somehow turning stretches into dissertations on virtue. That world lives an arm's length from today's wrestling match. Older men mingle with the young, not as coaches alone, but as citizens playing the long game of influence, mentorship, politics, and reputation. The line between education, networking, and posturing remains stable across time. The gymnasium trains bodies that will later vote, serve on juries, row triremes and recite speeches in the assembly. You soaked up civic glue while your hamstrings burned. Your endurance takes one more blow. Modesty norms and moral panics. Comedy loved to lampoon gym culture as too soft and too decadent. Aristophanes' Clouds, 423b, paraded an old-school chorus, praising the modest dust-loving boys of yore and mocking the newfangled, slick-haired youth who preferred banter to beating dust out of the past. Every era thinks the next one ruined civilization. The gymnasium is where that sermon gets preached, out loud, in the nude, with oil. The day shuts down. Staff sweep the sand smooth with big rakes, like resetting a chessboard. Tomorrow will print a new layer of footprints on the same canvas. Lamps flicker behind pillars. Voices recede. Someone tosses leftover dust from a bucket. A herm looks on, eternally unfazed. The olive oil amphorae glug in a storeroom. Bronze strigils clink into clay pots, like coins. You dress again in the Appaditerian. Tie your sandals, and suddenly the texture of linen on your scrubbed skin feels illegal. You carry your abalos, lighter now, and a soreness that buzzes like bees in the upper thighs. Your clothes smell faintly of yesterday and dust. You step outside, and Athens breathes around you. Vendors closing stalls in the agorabois, chasing each other past a fountain. A man rehearsing lines for a court speech under his breath, because law courts in Athens run on prepared speeches and nerves. The Acropolis lifts in the failing light. A potter's kiln puffs, a last gust of warm breath. The city's noises stretch then fold, as dinner sites crackle and hum. Your body catalogues the day's injuries with bureaucratic precision. Left shoulder grinds. Right wrist twinges. Both feet feel like they walked across gently microwaved stones. Lower back sends a diplomatic message. Cease and desist. Skin exfoliated within a molecule of its life. Salt crust along the hairline. The taste of clay a semi-permanent, resident in the mouth. Your appetite shakes off dust and demands bread, cheese, olives, maybe fish. Definitely a larger cup of diluted wine than Galen recommends, and a second slice of maza, because the ephebic oath did not include carb limits. On the walk home, your brain replays the day's collisions. The hurt wears a costume of satisfaction. It's the honest pain of old wood bending, but not breaking. The gymnasium doles out endurance, one scraped inch at a time. You got a sampler platter today. The regulars show up to wonder. The regulars show up tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. They do it through winter wind that whips through the xystos. They do it under summer scorch that bakes the paradromis. They grow strong in ways that don't read, on modern bathroom mirrors, ankles that won't quit, backs that hold up shields, hands that grab halters like old friends. They learn rules enforced by rods and rituals enforced by eye rolls. They turn olive oil into ache relief and into the gloyos that somebody will smear on a patient's sore knee with a prayer to Asclepius. They become the civic backbone of festivals, juries, ships, and hoplite lines. They argue about poetry at the edge of the ring and take sides in the latest political mess under a portico that will outlive all of them. And you, heroic, for a day, and nowhere close to heroic by their standards, step into the Athens evening as the sky goes deep blue and the first stars blink like a polite applause that isn't really for you. Your pulse steadies. Your shoulders sag into a truce. A dog barks from behind a wall. A flute note drifts loose from a courtyard where someone practices scales. Somewhere, Aristotle or one of his students murmurs about causes and categories. Somewhere else, a boxer and a wrestler swap cleaning tips for keeping leather from cracking. Somewhere in a tiny shop, a craftsman etches a maker's mark into a new striggle and thinks about how athletes will curse and bless his work tomorrow. This place would eat your day and ask for seconds. The dust would live on your skin, the oil in your pores, the ache in your ligaments. The bath would be cold, the food plain, the ref impatient. The rules would be older than your alarm clock and twice as stern. You would not last a day without a dozen reminders from bone and custom that you belong to a softer age. You made it to evening, erected by adrenaline and the thought of dinner. They made it to evening like this every day. And some of them kept going until their names landed in Pindar's meter, and their statues threw bronze shadows in sanctuaries older than your language. Walk home, breaded and battered, alive to the fact that antiquity's most glamorous body culture is equal parts altar and grindstone. The gymnasium smiles a dusty, oil-slicked smile behind you and closes its gates. Lamps wink. Tomorrow's sand lies ship-quiet and conspiratorial, already planning fresh footprints for feet that accept the bargain, because the bargain runs both ways. The city gives you a place to train, to be seen, to gossip, to honor gods who model labor and cunning. You give it your morning breath, your shoulders, your knees, your skin, and the possibility that even your scrapings will end up in someone's medicine chest. Your legs deliver you to your door, and the day folds shut like a papyrus letter you will never open again without wincing. You ease onto a bench. You sip water or thin wine and stare at your hands. They look older by an hour. The olive oil smell doesn't entirely leave. It lingers in the wrist, the hairline, the corners of the mind that now store the zistars and the palastra with the neat ferocity that new pain carves. A night breeze lifts the edge of your tunic. Somewhere nearby, a child rehearses a poem about Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion, and you privately think the lion had it easy because no one made it run barefoot on sand first. Athens hums at dinner. Firelight stitches red onto walls. Olive trees blacken into silhouettes. Stars settle into indifference. The gymnasium you will not return to tomorrow because you, unlike the regulars, have decided to live, rests behind you in its own kind of cosmic calm, a field of small labors that made large promises for centuries. The statues of Hermes guard doorways with granite patience. Heracles waits for the next boy, who thinks lifting a bull is a good warm-up. The logic of scraped bodies and cold baths continues without your consent. In a world stitched together by shared spaces and shared stories, the gymnasium keeps telling its favorite, one strength is a habit, not a highlight reel. You just learned the first line in dust. Let's dive into our next piece, the rise of the Akkadian Empire. Sargon the Conqueror. He built a capital so famous the world took its name from it, and then the city went missing. That is the sort of power move Sargon of Akkad specialized in. Empire maker, myth magnet, logistics champion of the 23rd century BIS. The clay tablets hand him a microphone, and he steps on stage like he invented the encore itself, bragging about 34 battles, an army on permanent payroll, and washing weapons in the 2 seas. Then historians check the receipts and find both hype and hard granite reality. The story hits like a bronze axe. Before Sargon, southern Mesopotamia was a patchwork grid of city-states with names that sound like an ancient playlist. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, each with its own temple, its own scribes, its own grudges, and an irrigation system that demanded constant cooperation and somehow produced constant war instead. The stellars of the vultures from Lagash, 2 centuries before Sargon, already showed spearmen in tight formation and decapitated enemies as a sort of municipal branding exercise. Politics ran on barley, baked clay, and swaggering kings known as Ensi or Lugal. The Sumerian king list imagined kingship as a divine franchise that popped up in one city, then relocated to the next, after someone won a fight or an omen. Real life looked more like a long, dusty scrum for water rights and trade routes, punctuated by extravagant temple building and accountants tracking barley rations down to the last handful. Into that scrum stepped Lugalzadjezi of Uruk, a man whose name sounds like a drum roll and whose inscriptions read like a victory parade. Around the mid-2300s BIS, by the middle chronology, he welded a rare coalition. He lorded it over Sumer from the Persian Gulf upstream, claiming that Enlil, chief god Nippur, handed him power. He also claimed to rule from the lower sea to the upper sea. Mesopotamian kings spoke in widescreen even before widescreen existed. Lugalzadjezi set the template for Sargon's next act. That made what happened next all the more savage. Sargon's origins sit in a blur, where dynasty building meets later legend. He later became Sargon in Akkadian. Sargon, the king is legitimate. That already sounds like rebranding with teeth. An old Babylonian story now called the Sargon birth legend casts him as the secret child of a high priestess, set adrift in a basket on a river, rescued by a gardener, and destined to rule. That tale lives on clay copies from over 1,000 years after Sargon, a hurled-back flash of royal propaganda, mixed with a miracle birth. Scholars like Mark van der Meerup and Piotr Michalowski file it under myth with an ancient side-eye. It tells more about how later scribes wanted to see him than about how he actually began. Primary sources point to a more grounded origin story that still plays like a plot twist. He served as cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of Kish. In ancient courts, cupbearer meant trusted insider, not glorified waiter. The role opened doors in palaces, treasuries, and strategy sessions. From there, Sargon did not ride a gentle elevator. Zababa blinked out of the records at the exact moment Sargon blinked in, and the king list unspools a classic dynastic cutaway. Sargon took kingship in Kish and logged a 56-year reign, according to one version of the king list. The middle chronology dates him roughly to 23, 423, 34, 22, 79 bar, a tidy 55 years of fire and admin. The early victories still smell like burnt reeds. Sargon hammered the city of Uruk and took Lugalzadjezi alive. He then paraded the defeated king to Nippur wearing a dog collar, delivering him to the gate of Enlil's temple like spoiled produce. That incident shows up in Sargon's own inscriptions, as compiled in Douglas Frayn's Royal Inscriptions of Mesopotamia. It is one of those moments where the stone says what nobody wants to hear. It was spectacle and message. The new boss humbled the old boss under the eyes of the gods. From there he rolled through Sumer, Ur, Lagash, Umma, cutting down anyone who still wanted to pretend it was the last decade. The city-state era did not end politely. He did not stop at Sumer. He pushed north and west along the Diyala and the Euphrates. He took Mari on the middle Euphrates and Nagar, modern Tel Brak, in the north, an old city with an eye temple, older than dynastic memory. He loomed over Ebla in Syria, although who torched, Ebla remains an academic boxing ring. Some give credit to Sargon. Others hand the match to his grandson, Naram Sin. Either way, Akkadian power moved like a river in flood. Sargon's inscriptions brag about reaching the cedar forest and the silver mountains. Translation: Lebanon for cedar, Taurus mountains for silver, and perhaps timber. He waded into Subatu in northern Mesopotamia, an elastic term that basically labels the northern frontier as a place full of people who did not enjoy Akkadian tax policy. To the east, Elam and Awan felt the knock on the door. The borderlands there are a parade of kings and counter-kings, but the momentum ran Akkadian. Sargon's successors Rimush and Manishtushu later boasted about breaking Elamite coalitions. The Manishtushu obelisk, actually a set of inscribed stone blocks found at Susa, reads like a land deal on steroids and testifies to how the Akkadians mixed conquest with contracts. Amid the thunder, the paperwork never slept. The new capital sealed the deal. Sargon built Akkad, also written Agade, and turned it into the neon sign of the age. Except the map swallowed it. Archaeologists have hunted for Akkad for well over a century. They scoured the plains around modern Baghdad, sifted through proposals near Kish, eyed sites near the Tigris, and nodded cautiously at Ishan Mizyad or Tel Muhammad. Still nothing definitive. It is a historical cliffhanger that refuses to resolve. The most famous city of the 3rd millennium boss remains a blank spot on a very well-studied map. Scholars like Mario Liverani turn that absence into a point. The city loomed so large in memory that its physical footprint slipped out of reach, either stripped for bricks in later eras or built over by later cities. The capital that branded an empire left a paper trail without a street address. Even without the street address, Sargon's own texts throw out a port scene that feels live. Ships from Meluhar, Magan, and Dilmun moored at Akkad's quay. Those place names point to a trade triangle. Melehar likely the Indus Valley, Magan probably Oman, with its copper, and Dilmun the island hubs around Bahrain. Dock that little boast next to real archaeology at sites in Bahrain and Oman, showing 3rd millennium trade, and the boast starts to look like a ledger entry. Copper shipments, exotic woods, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and carnelian beads snake down the Persian Gulf long before Sargon. He turned the flow into imperial messaging. He did not invent long-distance trade, but he planted an Akkadian flag in the middle of it. He planted that flag with a standing army too. One inscription says, he had 5,400 men who ate bread before him daily. That is not poetry. That is logistics flex. In an age without coins, payroll meant rations. Barley, beer, oil, measured in standard units, and handed out on schedule. A standing force of 5,000 plus may not sound monstrous to a modern state, but to a city-state world that relied on levies and temporary campaigns, a permanent, paid corps was the nuclear option of reliability. Those soldiers could garrison conquered cities, ride herd on governors, and form the spine of campaigns, without waiting for harvest season. Every lunch line was a small revolution. The weird genius of Sargon sits in that fusion. He took the Sumerian city template and then remodeled it to rule other cities. He kept local NC in some places, replaced them in others with Akkadian officials, and watched both. He posted garrisons strategically, especially along rivers and roads. He leaned on scribes who now wrote royal inscriptions in Akkadian as well as Sumerian. He hit the big sanctuaries and played the pious card with skill. He cultivated Ishtar, Inanna in Sumeria, the goddess of love and war, a patron anyone who planned on constant warfare needed on the team sheet. His own inscriptions credit her with handing him victory. He also gave her temples tangible gifts. No piece of that strategy hit harder than a single appointment. He made his daughter Enhidwana the high priestess of Nana at the Entum priestess, a role with serious control over rituals and temple wealth. Her compositions, the temple hymns, and the exaltation of Inanna survive on clay copied many centuries later, but dense with personal intensity and political stakes. Scholars like William Hallow and Annette Zagal have worked that corpus line by line. She may be the earliest named author in history, whose works still sit readable on a desk. Her hymns elevate Inanna's cosmic ferocity and fold Akkadian rule into the divine script. Later tradition remembered that she got kicked out during a political revolt and returned a poet priestess dragged through a crisis and then reinstated. That memory fuses faith, propaganda, and genuine craft. Her lines pound like drum beats, and they belong to a dynasty that wanted Sumerian religious legitimacy, every bit as much as it wanted new territory. The titles followed the conquests like medals pinned to a chest. King of Akkad, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters. To a modern ear, those sound theatrical. To an ancient audience, they announced a claim that stretched past one river valley. The phrase four quarters meant the known world in cardinal directions. Sargon did not control the whole world. He did control enough of it that the metaphor landed. In his reign and in the memory that followed, Sargon transformed kingship from a city's chief executive into a continental brand. That brand sat on top of non-stop friction. The inscriptions do not hide it. One text has Sargon boasting that in his old age, every land rose up against him, and he smote them in turn. The dramatic copy suggests a late-career firestorm in which the newly conquered regions tried to cash in on his exhaustion. He made sure they could not. Another text lists 34 battles. A number like that can be propaganda rhythm, a drumbeat number. Still, the wars were real enough that cities needed garrisons and governors needed watchmen. The administrative engine under the crown kept humming. Old Akkadian written language began to bloom as a state tool, side by side with Sumerian, still used for liturgy and many accounts. Clay tablet archives from sites like Tel Brak, Mari, and Gasur show Akkadian scribes dating transactions and sealing containers with cylinder seals that now look like bands of miniature graphic novels. No coins existed. Silver moved by weight. A shekel measured roughly 8.3 grams. 60 of those made a mina. Barley and oil rations were often denominated in seela, a unit of capacity around a liter, depending on the period. The details might sound dull, but they were the skeleton of empire. A military campaign can fail in a week. A state held by measurement can outlast a famine if the ledgers get it right. Sargon pushed that measurement deeper, into more places than any Mesopotamian king before him. He also weaponized terror without overcomplicating the script. Early Mesopotamian warfare chewed up fields and broke canal banks as deliberately as any catapult ever broke walls. Sargon's forces dismantled city walls and dismantled their future rebellion capacity. He planted loyal administrators named in Akkadian texts and backed them with soldiers. He minted the imperial core. People learned how Akkadian power looked and sounded. That familiarity hurt and wore down local resistance while normalizing new rule. Anyone who has read the year names of his successors sees it in headlines. Year he destroyed this city. Year he killed that coalition. Year he captured that king. The Akkadian state carved its life into calendar labels. When scholars walk through the fragments of Sargon's campaigns, they see targets picked for reason, not just pride. Lebanon's cedar, shipped east, turned temple roofs from palm slats into grand spans. Oman's copper fed metalworkers turning out axes, spear points, and tools. The Indus world's beads and woods spiced up elite wardrobes and temple fittings. Rivers functioned as highways. Caravans shoved across dry zones, measured in donkey loads and river barges. This was an economy built on amplified flows, not conquest for bragging rights alone. The boast in the inscription about ships mooring at Akkad's quay spells out value as much as victory. The culture changed alongside the math. Old Akkadian art sharpened into a style of intense realism and tight control. Gleaming metal images of kings wore carefully detailed hair and beards and gazed with a focus that says micromanagement never started in the corporate office. The famed copper alloy head, sometimes called Sargon's, found at Nineveh, bears eyes gouged out in later violence, and a symmetrical beard arrayed like a carved relief of ambition. Scholars debate whether it shows Sargon or his grandson, Naram-Sin. The point lands either way. The old Akkadian sculptor could do charisma and command in copper. Cylinder seals from the period stage heroic hunts and mythic combat with a fresh punch, and the people stamping those little epics on clay came from an administration that wanted visual messages to do the work of 1,000 decrees. Then there is the name game. Later, kings borrowed Sargons. The Assyrian Sargon II in the 8th century brass slapped it on like a championship ring and made sure his palace at Dur-Shurukin shouted it at travelers. That little move means that the Sargon in the Hebrew Bible at Isaiah 20 refers to the Neo-Assyrian king, not the man of Akkad. The double usage throws a party for confusion among non-specialists. The old Akkadian Sargon's name never turned into a gentle museum piece. It kept striding into later kingdoms to borrow credibility and kick open doors. The breathless line about him being the world's first empire maker gets a necessary tune-up. Ancient Egypt unified under kings centuries earlier, and Lugal-Zagezi claimed a from sea to sea hegemony right before Sargon. If the claim is tightened to Mesopotamia's first durable territorial empire, with a standing army and garrisoned provinces extending into Syria and Elam, the crown fits better. He did not invent empire. He did bolt together a model many later Mesopotamian kings envied and tried to imitate. The model fused force, freight, and theology. It worked well enough that it kept limping, and then sprinting long after he died. He died after a reign that tradition pins at over 5 decades. The machine did not stop. Rimmush, his son, inherited the job, and a plate piled with rebellions. Rimmush's inscriptions are lists of blood. He claims to have crushed a grand coalition in Elam, captured kings and subdued revolts in Sumer. The tone comes off like a courtroom reading of charges and penalties. He died violently, probably assassinated in a palace conspiracy. Manishtushu, another son, rode next and left longer administrative footprints. Land sales inscribed, temple donations recorded, and then also exited with assassination as the footnote. The palace kept buzzing. The knives kept working. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, took over and painted the map again. His victory stele now sits in the Louvre, a sloping mountain scene where Naram-Sin strides up wearing a horned helmet reserved for gods while enemies twist and fall. He claimed the title King of the Four Quarters and, more provocatively, divinity in his own lifetime. Administrative tablets called him God of Akkad. The Baskiki statue's inscription celebrates that apotheosis. It reads like a new gear in royal ideology. The scribes later blamed that new gear for everything that went wrong. The Sumerian poem, known as the Curse of Akkad, or the Curse of Akkad, or the Curse of Agad, accuses Naram-Sin of sacking the temple at Nippur after Enlil ignored his offerings and then suffering cosmic punishment as the Gutians invaded. That text is a surgical piece of literary revenge by later Sumerian-leaning scribes. It probably tells more about later politics and memory than about Naram-Sin's actual piety, or lack thereof. The historical Naram-Sin faced massive rebellions and foreign pressure, and he hit back hard. The poem turns complexity into a moral fable with a wicked hook. Back in Sargon's lane, the foundations that let Naram-Sin expand were Sargon's, standing troops, garrisoned nodes from southern Iraq into northern Syria. Governors who knew they served a center, not just a city. Priests entrenched in major temples whose offices doubled as diplomatic listening posts. A royal household stacked with talent and risk in equal measure. The empire could still blow apart. For nearly a century and a half, it did not. Even the brick-and-mortar equivalent of his social media posts kept circulating. The boast about 5,400 men eating bread before him daily echoes in textbooks for a reason. The phrasing turns a fact into a cinematic shot. A king with order in front of him, rank after rank eating in peace because he arranged violence elsewhere. The number lands because it comes off an Akkadian inscription without modern romance. Douglas Frayne catalogued it. Mario Liverani analysed the political theatre, The line survived because the claim hit the sweet spot where hyperbole meets credible detail. Another line lifts the image toward myth. He washed his weapons in the upper sea and the lower sea. That stylized sentence means he reached the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. Whether the exact shoreline saw his sandals is not the point. The phrase announces span. Combined with the cedar forest and silver mountains, it writes the empire into the map as a set of extreme points that everyone recognized. Trade out a GPS coordinate for mythic geography, and a Bronze Age audience read it without squinting. Then scribes repeated it until the words felt inevitable. Not every later myth deserves the same courtesy. The infant in a basket legend swirls with charm and irony, but the copies come from much later. The embellishments bloom under very different dynasties, and the plot tries a little too hard to anticipate Moses by a millennium. The story has historical value as a window into how Babylonian and Assyrian schools taught kids to see ancient kings, complete with river rescues and destiny. It does not hand a documentary camera to Sargon's childhood. Specialists like Jean Bottereau and Stephanie Daly handle these texts with a shrug that says myth can be potent without being a time machine. The other magnet for urban legends is a literal magnet, Akkad itself, because the capital did a vanishing act. Every find in central Iraq that smells like the late 3rd millennium gets stage whispered as maybe, possibly, what if this is Akkad? Scholars pump the brakes, because the location of an imperial core city is not a place for vibes. Lines in inscriptions triangulate it somewhere between Kish and Babylon, along the Tigris-Euphrates alluvium. A scribal dig at Izin or Sippar can throw out a helpful line, but no one has found a monumental city with inscriptions, shouting the city's own name. That ongoing blank fuels both grant proposals and late-night debates. Every time a proposed site fizzles, Sargon's brand gets burnished. The lost capital of the first great Mesopotamian empire keeps playing hard to get. Meanwhile, economists of the ancient world love pointing out how the Akkadian puzzle included tin. Copper alone makes soft bronze. Tin bronze holds an edge. Tin did not sit on Mesopotamian doorsteps. It likely came via long routes from the Zagros, central Iran, or as far as Afghanistan. That inflow turned the Gulf and overland tracks into arteries that empires tried to grip. When later texts mention Melahan, interpreters at Akkadian courts in southern Iraq, the mind does not need to stretch far. The port of Akkad's quay tied palaces to boardrooms built on reeds. Grain out, copper in, and a king in the middle, counting how many spearheads the new shipment could become. Sargon's empire also left footprints in legal and administrative timekeeping. The practice of naming years after major events was not his invention, but Akkadian use of year names and formulaic labels gives historians a way to stack events in the absence of absolute calendars. A year might be called the year Sargon destroyed Uruk. Another might celebrate the dedication of a temple or the cutting of a canal. Those labels turn the map into a timeline, letting scribes pin deliveries, lawsuits, and loans to a public memory of power. Later, kings refined the method. The habit speaks to a state that knew how memory could structure obedience. Another relevant layer is the north. When texts say he took Subatu, they draw a line that loops across the Jazeera and the foothills of the Taurus and Zagros. The north meant other languages, other polities, and hill zones that do not roll over easily for lowland plows or lowland kings. Old Akkadian administration at sites like Tel Brak shows a blend of Mesopotamian seal imagery and local continuity. Imperial centers always depress local souvenirs into their clay. Here, scholars read bilingualism, intermarriage, and tax envelopes on donkeyback as the empire's daily life. It is not just flags and blows. It is also seals and barley. When the myth machine hits top speed, the fall always lurks behind the triumph. The Akkadian Empire unraveled within a century after Naram Sin's peak. The king list says Shah Kali Shari, Naram Sin's son, fought constant wars. The Gutians, highland peoples from the Zagros, feature as villains in later Sumerian literature, maybe in part because they left so few inscriptions of their own to contradict the script. Modern climatologists and archaeologists add a second act, around 4.2 thousand years ago, roughly 2200 B. Evidence mounts for a major aridification event. Drought, dust, and migration flicker through layers at sites from Syria to Iran. Harvey Weiss and others argued for sharp climate stress. Critics argued over degree and timing. The safest line holds that environmental pressure combined with overextended wiring and internal revolt to yank the empire apart. The Akkadian state's strength was also its vulnerability, a web held taut across long distances. When multiple strands snapped at once, governors turned into micro-kings again, and tax routes turned into raiding paths. That collapse sits decades after Sargon himself. He never wrote the ending. He wrote the manual for being a problem. His kingship solidified a package of techniques that later empires reused shamelessly. Assyria's garrisons and deportations, Babylonia's reigns from city to city with a priestly backbone, Elam's pendulum with Susa, nudging the Mesopotamian lowlands, even the Hittites out in Anatolia reading Akkadian as a diplomatic lingua franca. These all live in a world Sargon helped make. The clay confirms it in silent consonants. By the old Babylonian period, scribes were writing letters and treaties in Akkadian across the Near East. When kings as far away as 14th century Bais, Egypt and Hatti swapped Amarna letters, they wrote in Akkadian. They did that because an Akkadian empire had once made Akkadian the language of getting deals done. He did not name himself modestly. Sargon, legitimate king. The pun chews with extra spice because he was a dynasty founder whose father's name either vanished or never got recorded. He answered the entire expected charge sheet. Usurper, outsider, upstart, with a name that said the gods and the people could sit down now. He then spent 5 decades making the label feel matter-of-fact. When later scribes had to explain Sargon's leap from cupbearer to overlord, they wrote destiny stories about river baskets. The name had done enough work that they did not bother arguing the legalities. The wider world he tapped kept on spinning. All across the 3rd millennium, Egyptian kings hunted cedar in Lebanon, one way or another. Hittite ancestors practiced metalwork in the Anatolian highlands, and Sumerian polities beat their drums in the north. Sargon put a single crown into that mix with the unapologetic tone of someone who saw the big picture early and never got tired of repeating it. The clay speaks for him. He destroyed walls. He garrisoned cities. He ate lunch surrounded by 5,400 soldiers, or at least that is what the line once tattooed on the mind. He marched rulers in humiliation to Nippur, to let Enlil's gate watch their collar, scrape the dust. He made his daughter the high priestess of so that the southern temples would feel Akkadian hands on their ledgers and Akkadian hymns in their choir. Historians like to poke the propaganda. Sargon's list of places conquered includes the kind of elastic ancient geography that begs for caution. Subatu might mean a coalition north of the Tigris this year, and a different warehouse of rebels the next. The cedar forest is not a dot on a sat-nav. It is a region with loggers and elites in byblos doing deals. The Silver Mountains are a swirl of Anatolian chains, with veins worth a raid season. Within those elastic terms, the empire's footprint can be mapped on ruins, graves, and storehouses. Mari's palace grew fat. Tel Brak's administrative quarter shows the Akkadian ceilings. Gassor's tablets shift language. Sipar, Kish and Nipper kept pumping out texts and digging canals. If the beams say cedar, the riverfront says Akkadian. He also ran on ritual. Akkadian kingship without Nippur would be like monarchy without a crown. Whoever controlled Nippur and the Kur of Endile could declare cosmic legality. Sargon hit that nexus early, and the dog-coloured march of Lugalza-Jesse to the gate still shouts that he understood. Ritual annihilated Lugalza's sacral claim as loudly as any fallen wall. Sargon's presence in Nippur, in Ur, in Uruk, and in Ishtar's temples pulled the cords of memory and habit every time a governor pulled out a new tax list. When the modern mind tries to rank Sargon as a leader, all the untranslatable things gather at his elbow. A world of contracts without coin. Boatmen who counted barley instead of paychecks. Soldiers who saw loyalty not as a slogan, but as Tuesday's bread and oil. Scribes who measured time with event names and jotted lines in a language that would one day ring out across empires. He juggled these, kept them moving in step, and added a tempo that felt like inevitability. Even his failures turn into his aura. The old age rebellion line does not make him look weak. It makes him look like a man so large the world wanted to try him, and he still put it back in place. Pieces of metal and stone help out the vibe, because the paper-thin modern patience likes to touch something. The copper head from Nineveh draws crowds. The victory stele of Naram Sin beams cosmic stair climbing into a museum hallway where tourists stop mid-footstep. The Manishtushu obelisk sits like a filing cabinet turned to basalt with columns of land transactions that still read in decimals of grain. Every artifact testifies that this was not just warfare strapped to buildings. It was warfare strapped to a bureaucracy. There is a caution worth keeping in the pocket. Archaeology and philology load the story with contested decimals. Chronologies have variants. The middle chronology puts Sargon's accession in 2334 BC. The short chronology bumps events later by a few decades. Scholars brawl politely over this, publish in journals, refute in footnotes, and then teach students to keep both in mind, like a truth and a backup truth. The outline stays stable. The exact years flex. A good scriptwriter lets the years dance without pretending the dance partner changes. Even the climate note rides a curb of debate. The 4.2 kiloyear event did not hit only Akkad or only once. Communities across the Near East and beyond stumbled under a bucket-dry sky. The complexity of human choices still matters. Gutian raids cut arteries. Rebellions by cities in Sumer strained garrisons. Trade with the Gulf flickered when supply shrank. Taxes pinched Behind it all ran a machine built by Sargon that could do remarkable things. It could not do everything. He stamped his ghost on, later ambitions anyway. Old Babylonian kings, like Hammurabi, stood in courtrooms orchestrating laws in Akkadian. Assyrian kings launched garrison campaigns into the north with Akkadian as the language of orders. When they needed to justify themselves to priests and publics, they reached for Sargon's kit. Ritual at Nippur, the title king of the four quarters. Humiliating captured enemies. In front of a temple gate, staging feasts for troops to show regular rations meant regular empire. Even at the edge of the late Bronze Age, kings wrote to each other in Akkadian because somewhere back on a floodplain, a cupbearer turned king built a language into the bureaucracy that became the default diplomatic plugin. Modern humor arrives because the human brain cannot carry that many barley rations without making a joke. The missing capital acts like a Bronze Age mic drop. He created a metropolis with docks busy enough that ships from the Indus and Oman loaded cargo on the same quay, and the city dematerialized into archaeological wishful thinking. He bragged about daily bread for 5,400 men, and now one can imagine the world's oldest HR complaint queue. He chose a name that said legitimate king, and now generations of scholars list his father as unknown, and then laugh nervously into their coffee. He humiliated Lugal-Zajazi at Enlil's gate, and millennia later, someone finds a text that mentions a dog collar, and the entire seminar falls silent for a second because the detail is so petty and so perfect. The myths deserve their own wry notes. The basket story is cinematic, yes. It is also a later piece of dynastic fan fiction tuned to deliver a message. The gods pick men for power no matter their birth. That kind of messaging aged well in Mesopotamia. Every city had stories of orphans adopted by kings, or shepherds chosen by gods, or meteors falling on sheep pens and marking next year's ruler. Sargon's legend sits in that chorus, but with stronger lungs. His actual records do not bother with swaddling cloths. They list walls dismantled and kings captured. There is one other detail that feels minor, until it turns out to be the keystone. Sargon threw his weight not only behind the god Enlil in Nippur and the goddess Ishtar in Akkad and Uruk, but behind the entire idea that kingship was a divine office with regional scope. City-states had gods with horizons. Empires need gods with wings. The cult of Ishtar amplified under Sargon and then roared under Naram-Sin. Enheduanna's poetry worked like a theological soundtrack, layering a Sumerian divine universe onto an Akkadian political one. That layering allowed a Semitic-speaking dynasty to run Sumerian-speaking cities without every temple turning into an opposition club. Bilingualism did as much work as the spearmen. The humor comes from the fact that in a world frantic for cedar, copper and lapis, words proved as important as axes. Tiny echoes add texture. Akkadian jobs included messengers, called shipru runners. Letters moved under seals. Courts recorded oaths by gods who would smash liars. Land deeds named field boundaries by the neighbor's date palm or the next canal. The Manishtushu obelisk spells out transactions with columns that look dry until one notices the quantities. Dozens of fields, laborers, listed like assets, silver weights specified to the shekel. Sargon's world bubbled like this. It was not just kings stomping and statues glinting. It was also clerks, listing donkeys by age, class, and bowmen signing for their oil ration on the tablet. Legacy worship sometimes. sails into cliché, so the last act lands back on evidence. Douglas Frayn's rhyme, volumes anchor Sargon's words in transliteration and translation. The Sumerian king list puts him on the roll, with 56 years and a flood of successors. The curse of Akkad oozes venom while telling a cautionary tale built on Naram Sin's back. In Hidwan's exaltation of Inanna rings with lines that still slap, even in English. The victory stele of Naram Sin crashes like a wave. Cylinder seals from old Akkadian lists scatter across museum cases, and every time a figure wrestles a lion or a king, steadies a spear, a viewer sees how the empire sold itself to the eyes. Archaeology at Tel Brak, Mari and the Diyala region bolsters the outline. Akkadian garrisons, Akkadian ceilings, Akkadian language sliding into desks 1,000 kilometers from Ur. Sargon built that. He built it fast by local standards and deep by any standard. He took the levers that a few cities used to dominate, neighbors, and scaled them into an architecture for ruling from the lower sea to the upper sea, or at least for making everybody think he did. The hard pieces, the standing army, the garrisons, the governors, might crumble next decade. The soft pieces, the language, the titles, the ritual choreography, outlived him, outlived his city, and outlived his dynasty. Some of his boasts were shameless fluff. Some were understatements, wearing bronze. He said he had 5,400 men dining daily in his presence. Ancient administrations counted heads with the precision of obsession. Would a scribe inflate the total for fun? Yes. Would an empire that large feed thousands of men on a regular schedule? Also yes, he said. He reached both seas. Everyone knew where those were. If he did not stand on the shore, his envoys and merchants did. He said he cut cedar. The temples in Sumer wore cedar crowns, like they had a lumber sponsor. He probably never dreamed that the capital would vanish. He definitely wanted the empire to last forever. The world had other ideas. Later centuries rained down Gutians, climate weirdness, and local kings who liked their sovereignty too much to gift it to a name on a stele. The Akkadian Empire cracked, then snapped, then splintered into a stew of city-states again, until the next consolidator showed up. The comeback tour was named Ur III, a few generations later, under kings like Ur, Nammu, and Shulgi. Those kings wrote in Sumerian again, and ruled from Ur. Their tax files are so dreamy that modern economic historians cite them underneath diagrams. They also invited in long-distance trade and bureaucracy the way Akkad taught everyone to do. Sargon himself stands where history blends stagecraft with blunt force. A cupbearer who became king. A Semitic-speaking Akkadian who tamed Sumerian temple centers. A ruler who had his daughter write hymns that glowed, who hammered a coalition king and walked him like a stray in front of the god's house, who turned the two rivers into a conveyor belt for empire. He called himself legitimate. The clay and the long afterlife of his techniques prove he did more than say it. He made it stick. There is a final sideways smile in that lost capital. He created a city so heavy in prestige and power that its name became the word for a language and for an age. Akkadian people, Akkadian language, Akkadian art. Meanwhile, the bricks are gone. Later builders scavenged. Later floods smeared. Sargon has to live in lines and in the stones of other rulers. That is a fate he might have appreciated. The king who redefined visibility ended up as a presence more than a place. In the museum case and on the clay tablet, that presence still snaps into focus. The empire rose because he combined fear, faith, freight, and the office meal plan. The fact that the office building itself disappeared only adds to the legend. From the late 24th century BIS, Sargon carved a straight line through a tangled landscape and taught everyone what empire could look like in Mesopotamia. The line still glows. It runs from Ishtar's temple to a lost key, from the cedar forest to the silver mountains, from a dog collar at Nippur to a column of soldiers breaking bread in order. The clay says he did it. The ruins agree with a tired shrug. The jokes soften the edges and keep the memory human. The history, under all the bravado, remains simple. He saw a world of small kings and chose to be large. He succeeded so thoroughly that long after the walls fell, the administrative habits and the language he promoted kept running their routes like couriers in the heat, still carrying his empire's echo toward the next city, and the next, and the next. For our next story, we explore the architectural innovations of the Mayan civilization. At dawn in the Maya lowlands, a stair-stepped mountain floats over mist. A roof comb carves the sky like a stone mohawk. Macaws slice through humid air. Somewhere down the plaza, a peloton of howler monkeys warms up like a death metal choir. The instinctive thought lands hard. An alien landing pad. It is not. It is limestone, willpower, and math stacked by hand into cities that treated sunlight like a precision instrument and rain like a resource to be engineered. That mix, cosmic drama and ruthless practicality, kept Maya architecture running for nearly 2,000 years, from humble pre-classic platforms around 1000 BY to flashy post-classic crowd pleasers at Chichen Itza in the 12th century. No steel, no wheels, no beasts of burden. Just quarries, plaster, and a calendar carved into stone, big enough to embarrass egos in 2026. A quiet pivot happens when the mind lets go of the tourist photo version of a pyramid and steps into how it was built. The Maya world is a soft limestone world. Cut it fresh, and it behaves like firm cheese. Give it air and time, and it cures into something that can take a lifetime of foot traffic and a millennium of jungle weather. The Maya exploited that chemistry with a vengeance. Blocks were dragged, yes, dragged, on sleds or fiber slings by teams of human porters called tamims. Sled groove still groove. A few ancient courtyards. No draft animals meant the logistics plan was essentially calf muscles and coordination. Quarries hugged most cities' edges. The rubble core came first, a heart of irregular stones set in a sticky lime mortar called saskap, then a neat skin of cut veneer stones lopped into place with tight joints and more plaster. Stucco, calcined limestone, baked around 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, made the hard white skin that gleamed in tropical sun. Brightly painted stucco too, because these buildings were not beige. The palette was hot, Maya blue, that indigo palygorskite hybrid that refuses to fade, hematite reds, charcoal blacks, and the kind of yellows that would get sponsored by energy drinks. Under those colors sat a signature innovation, the corbelled vault. No round Roman arch. Instead, walls stepped inward course by course, until they touched at the top, forming a triangular profile that looks like physics with a grudge. It lacks the keystone elegance of a true arch, but makes an honest, sturdy ceiling with software-level hackability. Stanchions can be slim, spans can be extended in clever sequences, and rooms can go long and narrow. Palenque's palace shows off vaults that still hold after 1,300 years of reign. Cobbled vaults everywhere, but with local flair. Long halls at Uxmal, tight chambers at Tikal, and those elegant roof comb frames that acted like stone billboards for royal propaganda. Roof combs were hollow, perforated to shave weight, then plastered with god masks, kings, and geometric patterns, like a billboard screaming lineage at passing generations. Think of a skyline built to look taller than it is. Roof combs are ancestral skyscraper hacks. That brilliance started early. The giant of the deep jungle is El Mirador in the Mirador Basin, mostly 300 bes to 150 c, pulling off a kind of architectural flex that had the classic cities playing catch-up. La Danta at El Mirador slaps with a height of around 72 meters from the lowlands floor and a volume that can shove modern stadiums into a locker, over 2.8 million cubic meters of fill, according to Richard Hanson's team. Triadic groups dominate, a central temple on a huge platform, flanked by two smaller ones, a form so consistent across pre-classic sites like Nakbay and Wakna that scholars tie it to Maya cosmology. 3 hearthstones of creation, Orion's belt, mythic places anchored in stone. El Mirador's causeways, Sakbiub, ran white and reflective across the swampy barjos, linking city to city like a concrete internet. Elevated limestone fill, plastered white at widths of 4 to 20 meters, sometimes raised several meters above the muck. One of the longest known came later, the Sake from Kobar to Yakshana, roughly 100 kilometers long and about 8 meters wide. Laid down in the late Classic or Terminal Classic around 600 to 800 C. The engineers didn't just make roads. They bounced sunlight at night off lime-bright surfaces that acted like natural reflectors. Torch processions on a Sakbi must have looked like comets on the move. The next plot twist sits in a plaza shaped like an idea, the E group. Archaeologists use that label for a platform and pie pyramid combo oriented to track the sun's yearly swing. The classic example is Uaxarktun's Group E, built around 500-300 bys. A western pyramid faces a low eastern platform, with 3 structures spaced so the sun rises over the northern building. At summer solstice, the center at equinox, and the southern at winter solstice. If one stands on the western pyramid, this isn't backyard astrology. It's scheduling in stone, phase-locked to agriculture and ritual. Ivan Sprach and Anthony Aveni have published extensive work on such alignments, showing that many Maya buildings and entire city grids echo astronomical cycles, not only solstices, but Venus risings, zenith passages, when shadows disappear at noon, and intervals connected to the 260 day sacred calendar. The city becomes a clock with patios and rooftops as hands and needles. All of it without a brass gear in sight, just lines of sight, pecked crosses incised on floors, for aiming, and the world's most committed sunrise people. At ground level, Maya architecture did heavy lifting under the glamour. Water ruled everything, especially in the porous limestone of the northern Yucatan, where rivers vanish underground like introverts at office parties. The Maya wrestled the problem into submission with choltons, bottle-shaped cisterns carved into bedrock and plastered smooth, with Aguada's artificial ponds sealed with lime, and with reservoirs that sometimes doubled as filters. In 2020, a University of Cincinnati team, led by Kenneth Tankersley, reported in PNAS that Tikal's Corriental Reservoir, in use during the late Classic, contained zeolite and crystalline quartz, layered to filter drinking water. Zeolite doesn't live at Tikal. The nearest source, it's about 30 kilometers away. So somebody hauled sacks of mineral purification tech through the jungle and built a system that, as analyzed in laboratory simulations, pulled out cyanobacteria and heavy metals. That study marks the oldest known zeolite filtration system in the Western Hemisphere. Not decorative, not intuitive without testing, purposeful, science-forward problem-solving. Over in Palenque, in today's Chiapas, engineers pulled off a clean water encore. The city's aqueducts channel spring water under vaulted tunnels, letting plazas float on top. In 2010, hydrologist Christopher Duffy and archaeologist Kirk French documented a narrowed segment in the Piedras Bolas aqueduct that created hydraulic pressure. Basically, a pressurized fountain existed in the 7th or 8th century. That is not a theoretical flourish. The constriction generated a head that could raise water several meters. Palenque's palace then looks a lot like a place designed to handle tropical downpours with elegance, still standing culverts, drains, and the kind of water noise that would make a spa jealous. Some household latrines even appear to have dedicated drains. Meanwhile, the city's heart, the Temple of the Inscriptions, built for Kinich Janab, Pakal I, died 683 C, folds into a 9-level pyramid, echoing the 9 layers of the Maya underworld. Its corbel vaulted stairway drops to Pakal's tomb, with a sarcophagus lid so iconic it launched 1,000 misread memes. No Rocket Man. The imagery tracks with Maya Ka, Kuhul Ajar mythology, as epigrapher Linda Scheller and later David Stewart have explained. World tree, celestial bird, and the king reborn. The absurd scale wasn't always tall. Sometimes it was long. Capan in Honduras cast miracles in detail. The hieroglyphic stairway, 63 steps and roughly 2,200 glyph blocks, reads like an epic carved into a staircase, set around the 8th century. Each step becomes a page. Each tread catches light differently through the day. The building itself narrates. The main acropolis at Copan is a lesson in precision masonry. Finely tooled volcanic tuff where limestone runs scarce, deep relief sculpture, and stairways that fit like puzzle pieces. The saber tree's cosmic axis isn't metaphor on a panel. It's literally built into courtyards with benches, oriented for rituals that stitched gods to government. Again, the blend. Story in stone, traffic patterns in math. Back in the central Peton, Tikal looms like an ancient city that never learned modesty. Temple I, often called the Temple of the Great Jaguar, stands about 47 meters tall. Temple II, across the plaza, comes in around 38 meters, and Longview champion Temple I rockets to approximately 65 meters, still piercing jungle like an elevator to the clouds. Construction at Tikal is layered like geologic strata of ambition, earlier platforms swallowed by later expansions, old stairways entombed inside new skins. Archaeologists peel that onion and find sequence, a small, early classic shrine, multiplied into a display of dynastic vitality. A single pyramid could hide 2 or 3 entire earlier versions. Within it, each entombed after a few decades of service, by a fresh build with fresher stucco and a more aggressive roof comb. That cycle raised the skyline, and raised stakes for kings. Epigraphy calls 562 sees a disaster year for Tikal, when Caracol beat it so thoroughly that a decades-long hiatus in monuments follows. Stone stops bragging, indicating political pain. When the city roars back in the 7th century, the buildings get bolder. New plazas, fresh terraces, and new alignments ride in. Old gods, new budgets. Those budgets had ecological price tags, visible in pollen cores. Lime plaster is energy hungry. Calcining limestone eats wood by the cartload. In the Mirador Basin, paleobotanists see spikes in copelpotanists see spikes in copal pollen and charcoal, alongside reductions in hardwoods during pre-classic building booms. Similar patterns show around classic centers. Stucco palaces were climate statements. Monumental whiteness took forests apart, tree by tree. The shine was the point. It grabbed sunlight, reflected moonlight, crushed retinas. At night, torches hit all that plaster like floodlights. The city glowed. The styles evolve like language dialects with regional grammar. In the Puke Hills of the northern Yucatan, where building stone is a fine-grained honey-brown limestone and flat bedrock, makes for easy foundations, architects in the late and terminal classic went mosaic mad. Uxmal, Kaaba, Sail and Labnar turned upper facades into intricate stone lace. The nunnery quadrangle at Uxmal piles on colonnettes, geometric fretwork, and shack, masks stacked like a totem pole, with a rain god's hooked nose erupting from every corner. Each mask doubles as a functional element. Waterspouts and cornice blocks combine aesthetics with plumbing awareness. The Pyramid of the Magician, oval in plan, 5 superimposed temples, final height around 35 meters, curves with a profile that looks like an architect learned how to bend stone. That curvature masks a sequence of superimpositions built between the 6th and 10th centuries. Elsewhere in the same region, Chen-style architecture slams myth into doorways with monster mouth portals. Step inside, step through a deity's jagged mouth. Rio Beck style throws faux architecture flex, twin towers that look like climbable pyramids, but with ridiculous steepness and fake stairways terminating in smooth veneer. It's a stone mic drop. Function isn't everything. Signaling matters. At Chichen Itza, engineering, cosmology, and what can only be called theater gear up to go viral across centuries. El Castillo, also called the Temple of Kukulkan, carries approximately 9 terraces. On each side, 4 staircases with 91 steps each, for a total of 364, plus the top platform to make 365. The base measures about 55.3 meters per side, and the height hits roughly 30 meters. It is rotated approximately 17 degrees east of north. On equinox evenings, triangular shadows slide down the north stairs balustrade to join a serpent head carving at the base, forming a writhing body of light and darkness. For a few minutes, that trick gets headlines and social media clips. It should. The safer reading, drawn from the work of Avani and others, places it in a suite of alignments that matter to the post-classic Maya Toltec folks who ran Chichen, solar cycles, Venus risings, and calendrical intervals built into architecture, not isolated stunts. The Great Ball Court, around 168 meters long and 70 meters wide, works like an acoustic dream. Clap and the echo chirps, a descending tone that sonic engineers, like David Lubman, have analyzed as a comb filter effect, created by the step spacing. eerily similar to the call of the resplendent quetzal, a royal bird. Whispers can carry along that court's walls. Scholars argue whether ancient ear designers modeled this effect, or whether the physics came as a delightful side bonus. Either way, the building turns sound into spectacle. The observatory at Chichen Itza, El Caracol, named for its spiral staircase, throws a round tower on a rectangular platform and stares at skies through slot windows. It's partly collapsed, but enough survives to see how viewing slits line up with celestial events. Debates remain over the exact targets, Venus, solstices, and more, but the structure plants astronomy like a flag on the city plan. Astronomer engineers could watch the planet that Maya scribes tracked obsessively in the Dresden Codex, with Venus tables accurate to within a day over centuries. That codex is post-classic, and not from Chichen specifically, but the cultural obsession lives in stone everywhere. Acoustics had another encore. In the ball court, relief panels depict the game with winners holding decapitated heads, a tableau that invites a new generation of sensationalist misreadings. The Maya ball game wasn't constant sacrifice at every match. It was ceremonial sport, with rules and variations over centuries. Sometimes it wrapped around elite rituals with lethal stakes. Sometimes it wrapped around elite rituals with lethal stakes, sometimes not. The architecture amplifies that theatre. Stone rings perch high off the ground. The walls climb vertical, an eye-shaped court with far from casual vantage points. An architectural sport that trained both shoulders and cosmology, gameplay as solar movement, rubber balls as celestial bodies, players as avatars. Meaning and function get coded into walls that still throw back echoes like a concert hall. Water again. In the Yucatan, cenotes, the karst sinkholes that puncture limestone like dropped marbles, anshored many settlements. Chichen Itza's sacred cenote funnels offerings into the underworld. Dredging over the past century pulled up gold, jade, wooden scepters, obsidian blades, and human bones. Sacrifice did occur, but stories of constant mass, human sacrifice, need dialing down. Archaeological context from dredges and controlled excavations indicates ritual depositions over time, not conveyor belt carnage. The quiet architectural innovation in cenote country sits in dustier corners. Systems of choltons, by the hundreds near puques, hesses often, oval chambers, with narrow necks, sometimes with plastered floors sloping to catch rain off house roofs. Those household-scale fix-ups build a city out of micro-engineering. As for urban planning, Maya builders loved axes, alignments, processional routes, and framed views. They played the long game with causeways. In the Petén, Tikals raised causeways. Causeways strutted across depressions and linked major ceremonial groups. In Yucatan, Cobal's Sargon network spooled like spider silk. Elevated and plastered, those causeways were the highways and fiber optics of their time. Trade, messages, and armies sprinted over them. At Cobal, Sacaborn to Yaxunar likely served political consolidation by forcing a line through territory that had recently changed hands. Ivan Sprachk and others note that many city grids tilt away from cardinal directions in repeated, meaningful ways. Sometimes 17 degrees east of north pops up across sites, indicating standardized cosmological templates across distances and centuries. These were not random stacks in jungle gaps. In the center of those plans were plazas tuned like stages. Their sizes vary with period. Inamata's work at Sebel shows huge central plazas forming as early as 950–850 bar, ahead of many temples, implying that space for assembly mattered before shock and awe pyramids took off. Later, at Tikal and Kalikmal, multiple plazas with distinct scales and orientations created a civic choreography: processions, dances, ball games, stela, unveilings, and market days. Each plaza faced glyph-marked stelae, dated billboards where kings recorded Khatoon endings, wars, marriages, and defeats. Stone didn't tweet. It did gloat. The stone medium had another killer app. It froze math. The Maya used a base 20 system, stacked place values vertically in inscriptions, and perfected a concept of zero by at least the 4th century C. One famous early zero appears at Chiapa de Corzo in Epi-Olmec, lands dated to 36 B, not Maya per se, but Maya monuments, such as Tikal Stela 29, dated 292 C. Display long count dates with explicit zero glyphs. Those numbers march across lintels and stairs. At Copan, the hieroglyphic stairway isn't just text, it's a numerical memory palace. Every step, every almanac entry, carved in stone, puts calendar into circulation with architecture. Buildings marked ceremonies at precise intervals, 9-layered pyramids nodding to the 9 underworlds, 13-tiered roof, masks nodding to the 13 heavens. Round day, numbers hammered into corners. That precision included playing with light. Many vaults have tiny slit windows or vents that arrow the sunbeam at key times. Doors line up so that on zenith passages, twice annually in the tropics, sunlight floods rooms directly, annihilating the noon shadow. Those moments, described by Anthony Aveni as no shadow days, turned roof lines and door frames into instruments. Openings in the walls behind altars could have glowed like laser beams for a few minutes, and that predictability meant the divine showed up on schedule. At Palenque's cross group, 3 temples: Temple of the Cross, Temple of the Foliated Cross, Temple of the Sun, form a triad narrating world creation. That triad locks to view lines that snag sunrise points over mountain saddles. Religion runs on timekeeping art. The classic myth to squash comes with a side of tinfoil. The masonry is not alien. CNC work. Toolkits were lithic, chert, flint, obsidian for fine cutting, stone hammers and axes, wood for scaffolds, fiber ropes for hauling. Copper arrived in Mesoamerica only in the late post-classic, too late for most big builds. No iron chisels here. The finish quality came from patient abrasion and knack. Repetitive corbelling produced smooth faults. Iterative plastering hid seams. Over time, veneer stones mimic machined surfaces. David Stewart's decipherments show names and dates where others once saw spaceships. The Quetzal Echo at Chichen Itza, analyzed in detail, lines up with step dimensions and wall distances that would make any stadium designer nod. The probable take is that Maya builders heard the effect and liked it. Designing for it deliberately would not be a stretch for people who built calendars into staircases. Engineering tackled vertical load like an art form. Stairways were broad, but not free-for-all. Temples often sprouted steep stairs, 60 to 70 degrees, more ladder than ascension ramp, a reminder that not every foot got access to the gods. Balustrades kept climbers honest. The most fragile bits, roof combs, got weight reduction surgery with interior cavities. Some of those cavities are accessible, showing a honeycomb of internal walls that lowered the mass while keeping the facade strong. The famous roof comb on Tikal's temple I once bore enormous stucco portraits. The face is eroded, but the comb stays like a dorsal fin. Below, buttresses hide in plain sight. Thick medial mouldings and sloping tullards distribute mass. The Maya invented nothing like Roman concrete, but created operational equivalents. Rubble core, mortar, and technique that could fill and cure into monolithic strength. Everything ties back to water, food, and fuel. Terraces contour hills to slow runoff and hold soil. Around Karakul, in Belize, LIDAR mapping revealed 200 square kilometers of terraced, drained agriculture, like a green quilt stitched to ridges and valleys. That same LIDAR blew the roof off assumptions about Maya density around 2018, when a consortium including Francisco Estradabelli and Marcelo Canuto showed that the lowlands were far more urbanized than eye-level surveys suggested. Invisible causeways, ramparts, and reservoirs emerge from bare earth. Laser scans, like ghosts of a grid. Carrion birds glide over what looks like jungle. The scan says, suburbia with pyramids. When the late 8th and 9th centuries roll in and the southern lowlands trend toward crisis, paleoclimate studies point to multi-year droughts around 820 to 940 se. Epigraphic records explode with war captions, and monument dedication sputters. Architecture looks like a feedback loop. Taller monuments need more lime. More lime needs more wood. Deforestation strains hydrology. Drought punishes the vulnerable. Meanwhile, elites ration water with giant reservoirs, and households with fewer choltons take the hit. In sites like Tikal, intense algae blooms and mercury contamination show up in sediments in some reservoirs by the terminal classic, possibly from cinnabar paint washing in. The engineering fight was valiant and inventive, but climate, politics, and resource draw down tag-teamed like champions. Not one collapse, plural, staggered, regionally distinct contractions that left northern centers, like Chichen Itza, flourishing even as southern centers dimmed. Through the contractions, the design playbook keeps adapting. Coastal cities like Tulum turn compact and defensive. The late cliffside city basks in Caribbean light, with walls encircling temples painted with coastal-styled murals. House compounds get more standardized. Altars become more modular. Platforms rely more on smaller labor pools. But every late city still carries the DNA of classic design. Rectangular rooms with corbelled vaults, stucco facades, and roofed galleries lined up to a discipline of orientation. East Coast style favors slanted war bases and lighthouse-like temples that seem to flirt with the sea breeze. Across Yucatan, family houses bulk up platforms like Lego bricks. A little temple here, a corn-grinding bench there, a short sake to grandma's hut. Back in the classic heartlands, a deeper layer of design gets nearly invisible for the casual wanderer. Pecked crosses on floors. These are shallow, incised plus signs or cross shapes, often with small drilled pits, sitting dead center in plazas or rooms. Scholars like Aveni identify them as surveying points. Teams would stretch cords between them to lay out sightlines. It's fieldwork geometry that stands in for theoretical math classes. Out in the quarries, stone faces bear tool marks, arranged with the kind of efficiency modern stonemasons respect. flaking scars that run parallel, then perpendicular, in steady sequences. Stone-by-stone data reveals work crews, paced by masters who knew how many blows per block per hour would hit quota. Lunch probably tasted like corn, beans, squash, and sweat. The Maya also turned buildings into pastes of stories, facet-told genealogies in stucco relief. The stupendously preserved 2013 find at Homel in Guatemala, a stucco frieze dating to around 590 C, reported by Francisco Estrada Belli's team, shows a king seated atop a giant earth monster mass, flanked by feathered serpents, with glyphs calling him Ajo of Naranjo. The thing spans 8 meters, painted red, blue, and yellow. It survived because a later construction entombed it like a time capsule. That case hints at a phenomenon. All over, new architecture encasing old propaganda. Not out of sentimentality, but out of structural efficiency and ideological layering. New dynasties didn't always erase the old. They literally stood on them. On the palace side, the kit is consistent, but not boring. Long-range ventilation, tiny window ports, and thick walls create interior climates that shame many modern buildings. Cool by day, warm by night, a stable rhythm, passive design avant la lettre. At Palenque, multi-story towers and arcades, rare in the deeper forest, make the palace a mashup of watchtower and breezy gallery. Lintels at Yaxchilan, carved from heavy sapodilla wood, bring internal decoration to a beam scale that defies today's developer imagination. Those wooden beams lasted centuries under cover. A handful survive because they fell and carbonized, or because they were reused in later structures. But their ghost slots remain above doorways, a reminder that Maya rooms carried weight in organic, as well as stone systems. Even bricks of story appear. On stair risers, the tourists barrel past. Piedras Negras, in Guatemala, turns out hieroglyphic benches, stone seating with inscriptions that identify patrons and contexts. A bench becomes an episode marker. Who sat here? Who spread cacao drinks? Who plotted alliances? In plazas, low platforms lined with small, evenly spaced stones mark market stalls, detected at Caracol and elsewhere, suggesting that the same space that hosted solar rituals also hosted the Tuesday produce rush. The grand narratives clasp hands with mundane life. A god mask looks down on a squash sale. City planning wrote that scene on purpose. Numbers keep anchoring the ore. Canara Caracol hits approximately 43 meters in height, often called Sky Place, with a sprawling complex of courtyards tiered like a wedding cake. Triadic groups at El Mirador stand on platforms that cover more than 130,000 square meters each. The largest sake near Cobar stretches around 100 kilometers long. Tikhal's central reservoirs together could store on the order of 60,000 to 90,000 cubic meters of water, enough to support urban populations through long dry seasons. Populations in Tikhal's broader hinterland likely exceeded 200,000 during the late Classic. These are not boutique temple towns. They are urban experiments with serious headcounts. Still, the critique committee in the back of the mind files a note: stucco everywhere, plaster everywhere, deforestation and drought. Sounds like a climate cautionary tale. Archaeologists tread carefully. Correlation is not causation. Yet the proxy data from lake cores, the charcoal spikes, and the plaster volumes whisper in chorus. Architecture that blinds at noon might wind down a landscape if governance fumbles the forest budget. The Maya didn't invent that mistake. The modern world just made it bigger. What the Maya did invent, beyond the corbel vault and a schedule-friendly city grid, is a mentality, architecture as the crosswalk where science, state, and story meet. An E-group turns sunrise into executive function. A triadic group turns cosmology into a view corridor. A ball court turns acoustics into moral theatre. A causeway turns alliance into a bright, raised line on the land. That consciousness travelled in people and in grout. Travellers from the Gulf Coast brought new stylings and also new obligations. Markets, garrisons, and new publics showed up to watch the serpent shadow in March and September. Chichen Itza's militaristic reliefs and Toltec-style columns around the Temple of the Warriors, with a Chakmul reclining on the platform receiving offerings, turn older Maya vocabularies into something that reads like a geopolitical mashup. Engineers just kept building, whatever the story demanded. The signature that refuses to fade, Maya blue, teaches another lesson. That pigment is a chemical marriage of indigo dye and palygorskite clay, heated together at around 150 degrees Celsius to lock in color. Murals at Bonampak, discovered in 1946 and painted around 790 C, drip with it. The murals themselves flip the script on primitivist clichés. Interior walls turned into narrative scrolls with battle scenes, musicians, captives, and costumed lords in detail. Crisp enough to embarrass airbrushed superhero posters. The rooms are not giant. The color palette is not timid. The acoustics would have been intimate. A hall designed for stories told with a flute's piercing voice and a drum's heartbeat. The labor that raised these marvels was not abstract. Teams of masons worked in shifted cycles that archaeologists can sometimes track in masonry courses. Subtle variations in finish and block size suggest crews with distinct styles. Household compounds, mapped with dirt-level patience, show work staging on patios, bark beaters, and manos on one side, a lime kiln scar on the other, burning limestone to make lime needed brushwood, and hardwood both. Lime kilns often sit just outside residential zones, a sensible buffer against heat and smoke. Work was scheduled to the dry and rainy seasons. The architectural calendar is ecological. Glyphic inscriptions catch the cuffs and collars of those schedules. Dedication texts call out Holton or Catan endings. 5 or 20-year cycles, when temples must be rededicated, stairs recarved, or roof combs replastered. Time-mandated maintenance. When the calendar ticked, paintbrushes came out. That reveals something both prosaic and profound. Buildings were not frozen. They breathed. They were repainted, replastered, expanded, revised, occasionally toppled, then archived inside newer constructions. Much of what looks eternal survived, because someone tucked it into a stone cocoon. Elsewhere in the Maya sphere, regional specifics rewired the aesthetic. In the highlands, where volcanic stone dominates and quarries behave differently, a place like Caminaljuyu, near modern Guatemala City, built massive platforms in adobe and tuff, with earthworks and canals that rerouted Lake Miraflores. The capital moved, the waters changed, and the city's platform complexes dimmed, but the engineering chops rang clear, hydrology before temples. In the north, Isarcerido Cerrido Surivtezatean Tsars poured, with miniaturized versions of inland architecture perched on a reef edge, speaking nautical trade as much as ritual. Diversity across geography meant different building problems, solved with the same underlying grammar. One more trick deserves applause. Near Puke method precision. The builders in that region carved veneer stones so thin and regular that facades act like giant jigsaw puzzles. The lower half of a building often stays plain, functional load-bearing blocks, while the upper half gets the intricate mosaic. It's not laziness, it's structural calculus. Keep the weight down where overhang risk increases. The result is facades that read as lace and hold as armor. Cornices act like drip edges, sewn together. Colonnettes avoid big cantilevers. Stones interlock in ways that allow small repairs without tearing the wall apart. Maintenance-friendly design rarely gets awards. The Maya snuck it into the award show anyway. In the 21st century, LiDAR lifts the literal canopy off this world. Scans reveal ditch and rampart fortifications, wrapping some sites, complicating the peaceful astronomer stereotype. Dos Pillars bristles with fortifications, a city that went full bunker culture by the late 8th century. Walled compounds and hidden staircases speak to times when defense mattered, as much as ritual geometry. Architecture responds to geopolitics like a seismograph. War lines show up as quick-build embankments and strategic wall openings that funnel intruders into kill zones. Yes, that phrase belongs in a video game. The Maya built it in limestone and mud first. Meanwhile, the myth factory does what it does. A tourist hears that El Castillo has 365 steps, and a snake appears on equinox. True enough on the numbers, those steps can be counted in 5 different ways and still hit 365, depending on whether the top platform counts. The snake shadow appears, but requires clear weather, clean lines of sight, and some imagination. The larger reality swallows both. Chichen Itza is a city of syncretism, with multiple calendar monuments. The equinox trick is one exclamation mark among many. Another exaggeration gets declawed. The Maya discovered the golden ratio and built everything to it. Architects pass facades and find ratios, yes. People good at building often gravitate to pleasing proportions. But the best scholars see modular units based on human scale and vigesimal math more than mystical Euclidean secrets. Repetition in module sizes and step heights says standardization, not Euclid whispering on a vine. Everywhere, numbers pulse. Stair rises at Palenque average around 18 to 22 centimeters, comfortable for ceremonial climbing. Doorways often standardize around ratios, like 1:4 for height width, wall thickness, a modular rhythm visible in lintel slots, and jamb blocks. Roof vents appear in patterns that channel convection effectively. Corbel offsets per course, often 3 to 5 centimeters, accumulate to peaks that hold just enough compressive force to lock in. These are not accidents. They are craft run long enough to become rule. The social dimension of architecture runs hard in stone. Stelae line processional ways, not just to remember kings, but to set up touch points where community encountered time. The Maya calendar complex, long count, 260, day Tauk, Keen, 365, day Harper, and 52-year calendar round, prints itself on buildings in layout, terrace counts, and panel placements. When a katoon ended, citizens felt it underfoot, plaster drums under sandals on a refurbished plaza. The building literally felt different that week. Ritual moved like weather through designed space. Take the palace at Palenque again, because it deserves seconds. The tower's purpose is debated. Watchtower, observatory, lightning rod for royal ego. The aqueduct thunders below. Courtyards plate the complex in levels, with sub-rooms, off to the side where scribes scratched dates and titles on bone and shell. That palace is a machine for making kings appear as cosmic administrators, rolling out of a vaulted room with incense burners, smoking, and a polished platform underfoot. Anyone watching from the courtyard railings saw narrative architecture, doorways framing backdrops of carved panels, door illusions, creating forced perspective. At Tikal's central acropolis, multi-story palaces lace around courtyards, with narrow corridors constraining foot traffic, procession management in plaster. Outside the urban glam, ordinary households built small, but with the same grammar, platform, perishable, superstructure, of wattle and daub, thatch roof, alignment to a common axis, and a patio as the stage for daily ritual. Kitchens cluster to one side. Shrines sit in another. A Cholton throat opens near the patio edge, like a throat of the earth. Architecture is everyone's business. Daily life and the temple crest share a language. Ball chords multiply across sites because they are flexible. They host the ball game, yes, but also markets, announcements, and rituals that dramatize creation myths. The court's eye shape, with alleys and end zones, orchestrates movement and focus. Whistles and drums echo. The architecture assists the soundtrack. Step spacing is seldom uniform. Small adjustments to correct for perspective or align to adjacent buildings are subtle but effective. The standardization isn't oppressive. It's tuned. Some micro-inventions hide and deserve fanfare. In the Puka region, Saskab pits mined for fine limestone powder became basements and cave-like storage. Once stripped, builders recycled workspace into living space. Bolt holes on facades hint at temporary scaffolds, wooden poles inserted, wrapped with fiber ropes, with platforms perched atop like Lego on toothpicks. No nails, no steel brackets. Balanced engineering, with an understanding of load distribution. Rope fiber, henequen in the Yucatan, served as the high-tensile wonder material, turning short logs into cranes. The Maya were also masters of subfloor magic. Floors contain caches, jade beads, obsidian blades, marine shells, brought from coasts 150 kilometers away, arranged according to cosmograms. Compressed into plaster, those objects turned a floor into a talisman. This wasn't mere superstition. It communicated to participants that the room itself held power. The space became a legal instrument. Claude Lévi-Strauss would write papers. The Maya cut holes and buried shells. Modern archaeology adds its own layer of innovation to the interpretation. Ground-penetrating radar at Tikal and elsewhere finds voids that are tunnels, tombs, or drainage channels. GPR at Chichen Itza suggests that El Castillo sits atop a natural cenote cavity, fitting for a city whose name references, at the mouth of the well. Stable isotope analysis on plaster reveals water sources used for mixing. Heavy oxygen isotopes whisper whether seasons of drought forced changes. Mercury residues, cinnabar pigments ground and mixed into paint, show up in reservoirs, a surprise that tells a tale of unintended consequences. Even the Quetzal chirp got measured with modern kits. Microphones and spectrograms proved the echo's frequency sweep corresponds to the bird's call, a kind of sonic semiotics the ancients likely embraced, if not pre-planned, to 3 decimals. There is one more myth to pin to the mat. That classic Maya cities were empty, ceremonial centers with no urban populations. Excavation after excavation after excavation says otherwise. Residential structures stretch for kilometers beyond plazas, packed into neighborhoods with wells, gardens, and middens. Trash is the best friend of truth. It piles where people live. Fish bones from inland sites indicate trade with coasts. Deer bones whisper. Hunting limits. Ceramic styles map social identities. Architecture, the big stuff, sat inside a quilt of domestic building. The pyramid isn't a loner. It's a neighbor to 1,000 kitchens. The story ends where it started, with a silhouette in haze. Not because the view is pretty, though that helps, but because the profile encodes everything: materials, math, myth, and management. A roof cone that looks fragile and flamboyant proves to be a calculated compromise between weight and visibility. A staircase that looks merciless turns out to stage a procession down to plaza-level rituals, clocked to a solstice sunrise. A white road across swampy forest reads as arrogance until it is walked. Then it reads as connection. Archaeologists can list the provenances of the stones, the angles of the alignments, the granulometry of the mortar. The Wi-Fi password to the past, though, sits in the mix, a society that learned how to make architecture talk across centuries. It talked by tracking zenith sun on a temple floor, by hoarding rain in a bottle-shaped hole lined with the literal bones of seashell chemistry, by aiming a serpent, shadow, to remind the crowd that cycles return, rulers change, rain might not. It announced power and taught time in the same breath. For anyone who insists on aliens, there is always one last response available. The Maya did everything listed here with stone tools and social organization. If aliens showed up, they didn't drop blueprints. They dropped a gym membership. Jokes aside, the receipts are in the field. Notes in the lab papers. Panis 2020 on the lab papers. Panis 2020 on zeolite filtration. At Tikal. Duffy and French 2010 on Palanque's hydraulic pressure. Aveni Sprach on orientations. Inomata on early plazas. Stewart on epigraphy. LiDAR studies by Canuto, Estrada Belli, and colleagues, lighting up the jungle with megacity patterns. The consensus is simple and loud. Maya architecture wasn't a stack of pretty steps. It was a set of inventions that turned sun, stone, and rain into a city that could schedule the cosmos and sip clean water while doing it. Stand in any of those plazas. In the mind, in a photo, or in muddy boots, and watch the light slide along a stair edge. The drama is on purpose. The data points cluster underfoot. A call bell vault grabs a cool draft. A chultun throat swallows a bucket. A provcomb spikes the horizon so a traveller, 5 kilometers away, knows which god has the best publicist. That's the innovation. To turn architecture into a language that still reads after 1,000 monsoons. Stubborn and charismatic, even with the jungle trying to steal the script back leaf by leaf.